In the year 1350, your life depended on the meticulous art of the smokehouse. We are recreating the slow, soot-stained process of preserving fish on hand-carved wooden racks, just as it was done centuries ago. Watch the smoldering embers turn a raw catch into a vital winter lifeline tonight. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter 1. When the days grew short. Close your eyes and imagine a village 1,000 years ago. Not a grand castle, not a city with tall towers, not even the kind of picturesque hamlet you might see painted on the side of a country inn with its roses around the door and its cheerful smoke curling from a tidy chimney. No, this is something rawer than that. Something older, something that sits in the landscape not as a decoration but as a necessity, the way a bird's nest sits in a tree, shaped entirely by the demands of survival rather than by any desire for beauty. Just a scattering of low thatched cottages, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, crouched together at the edge of a great forest. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches plastered over with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, and they are the color of the earth itself, dark and damp and ancient-looking, even when newly built. The thatch on the roofs is thick, almost shaggy, cut from the riverside reeds in summer and laid in heavy, overlapping layers to shed the rain. Some of the cottages have small gardens fenced against the deer and the rabbits, scraggly plots of root vegetables, a few herbs, a leggy row of cabbages. Most have a rough pen where a pig rootles in the mud, or a goat stares with its uncanny rectangular eyes at anyone who passes. The forest begins almost at the back walls of the farthest cottages. It is not the managed, park-like woodland of a later century. It is old-growth forest, enormous oaks with trunks too wide for 2 men to embrace, their branches reaching out like the arms of ancient priests, their roots breaking the ground in great dark ridges. Deeper in, where the light fails completely even on midsummer afternoons, the trees press together so thickly that the undergrowth cannot grow, and the ground is bare black earth, soft with 1,000 years of fallen leaves. The forest is full of things the village needs: timber, firewood, pannage for the pigs in autumn, mushrooms, berries, the occasional deer taken quietly and without too much discussion of who technically owned it. The forest is also full of things the village fears: wolves, certainly, and bears in the deeper regions, and the complicated presence of darkness itself, of being genuinely lost in a world before roads and maps and electric torches. The village sits between these two worlds, the cultivated fields on one side, cleared from the forest's edge with enormous labor over several generations, plowed in long strips that ripple away toward the low horizon, the dark trees on the other. It is a position of perpetual negotiation, the village always pressing outward against the wilderness and the wilderness always pressing back. Now it is autumn, and the children of this village know it before anyone tells them. They know it because of the light. Medieval people were attuned to light in a way we have almost entirely lost, because they had no artificial illumination worthy of the name. A tallow candle, if you were lucky, a rushlight dipped in fat, guttering and smoky. Firelight from the central hearth, which warmed the single room of the cottage in which the entire family slept and cooked and lived and, in hard winters, sheltered the most vulnerable of the animals. Beyond the glow of the fire, the world was genuinely dark in a way that most of us have never experienced. A darkness so complete that you navigated by memory rather than sight. And so the lengthening of the days in spring and the shortening in autumn were not abstractions noted in a calendar. They were felt in the bones. The children noticed when the sun started to set before their suppers were eaten. They noticed the quality of the morning light changing, moving from the clear, high, golden light of summer to something lower, more horizontal, amber and melancholy, casting long shadows across the stubbled fields from the moment it rose. They know it because of the smell of the air. Autumn in Northern Europe has a very particular smell, the smell of vegetable matter beginning to break down. The rich, complex, faintly sweet scent of decomposition that is, paradoxically, one of the most pleasant smells in nature. Fallen apples rotting under the trees in the orchard at the edge of the fields. wet leaves plastered to the path that runs from the village to the mill, the mud of the riverbank turned up by the feet of cattle coming to drink, releasing something deep and mineral and ancient. Wood smoke, always, from the fire that was never allowed to go out, but changing now from the dry summer smell of burning bark and twigs to something damper, heavier, the smell of green wood beginning to be burned as the seasoned stalks ran low. And over all of it, on the right mornings, drifting down from the low building at the edge of the wood where the trees begin, that other smell. That ancient, complicated smell that the children had breathed in every autumn of their short lives, and that their parents had breathed in every autumn of theirs, back and back and back through generations so numerous as to be uncountable. The smell of fish, smoke, the smell of the season turning in earnest toward the long dark. The building from which it came was the smokehouse, and in a moment we will go inside. But first, stay outside in the autumn morning for a little while longer, because the scene around you tells you everything about why the smokehouse exists and why it matters so much. Look at the fields. The harvest is done, or nearly done. The grain, wheat on the better ground, rye on the poorer. Barley in the lower fields where the soil stays wet has been cut and bound and carted and threshed. The great communal labor of harvest is over, and the fields lie open and empty now, the stubble pale against the dark earth. The gleaning done, the last of the summer's abundance either stored or gone. There will be no more grain coming in until next summer. What is in the granary now is what there is. Not a grain more can be grown or gathered until the earth warms again in the spring. The mathematics of this fact settle over the village like a weight. Count what you have, know what you need, understand the gap between them, manage it or face the consequences. Look at the garden plots. The last of the root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, the occasional carrot, are being lifted now, their knobbed and earthy forms carried inside and packed in damp sand in the cool corner of the cottage where they will keep, imperfectly, through the colder months. The herbs have been cut and tied in bundles and hung from the rafters to dry. The cabbages have been pickled, or the outer leaves stripped and the hearts buried in straw. The dried beans and peas rattle in their pods, waiting to be shelled and stored. All of this careful, exhausting, meticulous storing, is a race against the same clock, the clock that is ticking since the last warm day and will not stop until spring. And look at the river, there, at the edge of the village, where the path drops down between willow trees to the dark water. The men are out in their flat-bottomed boats, and what they are doing is not leisure. They are fishing with a focused, almost desperate intensity, casting their nets again and again, hauling them in heavy and dripping and glinting silver in the pale morning light, because the river, too, is telling them that the season has shifted. The fish are moving. The fish are here now, in the kinds of numbers that make your arms ache just to haul in the nets, and they will not be here for very much longer. This is the world in which the autumn smoking begins. A world of urgency, of counting and calculating and working from first light to last. A world in which the future, winter, the dark months, the long stretch between now and spring, is a real and present threat that must be managed with skill and labor and collective effort. A world in which the smell of fish smoke drifting from the old black building at the edge of the trees is not incidental, not a curiosity, not a quaint tradition. It is as necessary as breath. And here is the thing that is so important to understand about that smell, about those fires, about the whole enormous effort of the autumn smoking. None of it was invented. In the Middle Ages, it was not a medieval discovery or a medieval innovation. The smoking of fish to preserve it stretches back to the very beginning of human cooking, back to the first human beings who noticed that meat left near a fire lasted longer than meat left away from one, and who began, slowly, over generations, to figure out how to use that observation deliberately. Archaeological evidence of fish smoking has been found at sites that are tens of thousands of years old. The knowledge of it is older than agriculture, older than permanent settlements, older than the wheel. It is one of the most ancient technologies human beings possess. The medieval village inherited this knowledge the way it inherited everything it knew, not from books, of which there were virtually none in a peasant village, and not from formal instruction, but from watching and doing, from being shown by an older hand, from the accumulated practical wisdom of an unbroken human chain stretching back into the deep past. The grandmother who showed the mother, who showed the daughter, who showed her daughter, in turn. Each autumn, how to gut a fish correctly and pack it in salt and hang it in the smoke at the right height for the right number of days. This knowledge was not written anywhere. It existed only in the hands and the memory of the people who practiced it, and it was therefore both infinitely robust, capable of surviving for thousands of years, and infinitely fragile, capable of dying with a single generation, if not passed on. In the medieval village, it was always passed on. The autumn was the teaching season, in this as in so many things. The young learned by doing, at the elbows of the experienced, in the smoky air of the curing house, and by the time they were old enough to run the operation themselves, they knew it in their bodies, in the way that genuine skill always lives, not as a set of rules to be remembered, but as an intuition, a feel, a knowing that does not require conscious thought. Settle now into the rhythm of this autumn morning. The day has begun before full light. It always begins before full light in a medieval village, because there is always more to do than there are hours to do it in, and the hours themselves are shorter than they used to be. The children have carried water from the river and fed the pig, and swept the ash from the hearth. The women have set the porridge on to cook a thick grey, nourishing sludge of oats, or barley. That is the foundation of the medieval diet, eaten morning and evening, every day, year-round. The men have gone to the river with the nets, or to the fields to do the last of the autumn ploughing, or down to the smokehouse to tend the fires that were banked last night and must be brought up carefully to the right heat before the day's curing can proceed. The smoke rises in the cold air. The smell of it wraps itself around the whole village like something alive, and the children, eating their porridge in the doorways of the cottages, watching the pale sun haul itself above the tree line to the east, breathe it in and feel, in whatever way a child feels things that have not yet become ideas, that all is proceeding as it should. The adults are doing what they are supposed to do. The fires are lit. The fish are being tended. The world is turning in its appointed way. Winter is coming, yes, hard and cold and hungry as it always is. But the village is not unprepared. The village has done this before, and the smoke rising from the old black building at the edge of the trees is the proof of it, the visible, fragrant, ancient evidence of a community that knows how to take care of itself. This is where we begin, in the smell and the cold morning light of an autumn 1,000 years gone, in a village that is at once completely foreign to us, in its poverty, its darkness, its daily intimacy with the real possibility of death, and utterly familiar, because the people in it are us. They are hungry and tired and worried about the future. They love their children and fear the winter. They take comfort from familiar smells and the knowledge that the people around them know what they are doing. They are managing, as best they can, the eternal human problem of not having quite enough of anything and needing to make it stretch. And they are smoking fish. They are smoking fish because the autumn has come and the fish are here and the winter will be long. And because their grandmothers smoked fish and their grandmothers' grandmothers smoked fish, back and back through a chain of autumns, so long it disappears into the mist of prehistoric time. They are doing it because it works. Because smoke is magic of the most practical, most human kind, not the magic of transformation or transcendence, but the quieter, more essential magic of extension. The magic of taking something that would last 2 days and making it last 2 months. The magic of turning the river's brief autumn gift into something that can be carried forward through the dark and given back, a piece at a time, through the long winter nights, keeping the people alive until the spring comes again and the world begins once more to grow. That is the magic of the autumn smoke. And to understand it fully, we must go deeper into the river, into the salt, into the ancient chemistry of hardwood and heat, into the religion and the economics and the ecology of the medieval world that made all of this not merely useful, but absolutely indispensable. We must follow the fish from the water to the smokehouse to the winter table and understand at every step what it meant, truly meant, in the most literal and urgent sense, to have it there. But first, just for a moment longer, breathe in the autumn morning, the cold air, the pale sun, the porridge smoke from the cottage hearths, and underneath it, always underneath it, like the bass note of a chord that holds everything else together, the deep, dark, resinous, particular, irreplaceable smell of the fish smoke, rising into the grey sky above the old black building, telling everyone who smells it the same thing, the same simple, endlessly reassuring thing. We are ready. We have done the work. We will survive this winter too. Chapter 2. The River's Last Gift. Every medieval village that could, and most that were situated anywhere in the lowlands and river valleys of northern Europe certainly could, settled near water. This was not a matter of preference or of the human fondness for a pretty view. It was a survival imperative, as basic and non-negotiable as the need to be near land that could be farmed. A village without access to fresh water was not a village that would persist for very long, and a village with access to a river, a proper river, with breadth and depth and a good current, was a village that had been given, along with its water supply, something it perhaps did not fully appreciate at first, but came over centuries to depend upon with an almost religious intensity. It had been given a larder that restocked itself. The rivers of medieval Europe were not the compromised, silted, chemically burdened waterways that many of them have become in the centuries since. They were clean, genuinely, spectacularly clean, in the way that only water can be clean when there is no industry upstream. No agricultural runoff laden with artificial fertilizers, no sewage treatment plants whose imperfect work leaches residue into the flow. They were cold in winter and cool in summer. They ran clear over beds of gravel and sand, and they were alive with fish in a way that is now almost impossible to imagine. Not because we lack imagination, but because we have simply never seen a river at its full, unmolested, pre-industrial biological capacity. The medieval peasant fisherman pulling his net from the river in autumn was not catching a modest haul to supplement a meal. He was sometimes hauling in fish by the cutload. Contemporary accounts, monks writing in their careful Latin from riverside abbeys, estate managers noting quantities of fish taken from Lord's waters, merchants recording the volumes traded at river ports, speak again and again in numbers that seem, to the modern reader, almost fabulously large. Thousands of eels taken in a single night's work. Salmon so numerous in certain rivers that servants in grand houses successfully petitioned their employers to be fed the fish no more than 3 times a week, because eating it every day had become too much to bear. Pike so large they were spoken of with the kind of awed respect that we reserve for great animals. The river gave all of this, and it gave it according to a rhythm so reliable that medieval communities built their entire agricultural and economic calendars around it. Spring brought the first run of fish after the winter lean. Summer brought steady fishing in the long, warm evenings, the water low and clear and the fish easily seen. But autumn was the crescendo, the great final abundance before the river slowed and the fish retreated to deeper water and the whole watery world contracted into its winter dormancy. In autumn, several things happened simultaneously in the waterways of northern Europe that combined to create a fishing opportunity of extraordinary richness. The salmon, which had spent the year fattening in the ocean, came surging back into the rivers in which they had been born, driven by a navigational instinct so precise and so ancient that it borders on a mystical finding. Their home river from hundreds of miles away by the smell of the water itself, the unique chemical signature of the gravel beds where they had hatched as eggs. They ran upstream in silver waves, leaping the shallows, fighting the current, growing darker and more hook-jawed as they went, and they could be taken in enormous numbers at weirs and fish traps set across the narrow reaches, scooped from the water with hand nets at the falls, speared in the shallows by men who waded in barefoot despite the cold because the fish were too numerous and too important to let pass. The eels gathered for their own mysterious migration. Eels are among the strangest creatures in the biological world. They are born in the Sargasso Sea, a vast gyre of warm water in the Atlantic, and drift for years as larvae on the ocean currents until they reach the European rivers, which they ascend and in which they live for decades, growing fat in the mud of the riverbed. And then, in autumn, something happens to them. They become restless. Their eyes grow large and silver bright, adapted for ocean navigation. Their bodies change color, from yellow-brown to silver, as if in preparation for a journey they have never made, but somehow know how to take. They gather in enormous concentrations at the mouths of rivers and in the lower reaches, waiting for the autumn floods and the dark of the moon, and then they move, billions of them, all at once, slipping downstream toward the sea and the deep warm water where they will spawn and die, none of them ever to return. For the villagers along the river, this gathering was an annual bonanza. Eel traps set in autumn could be pulled out, dripping with dozens of fish in a single lifting. The eels were fat and rich and oily, wonderful for smoking, because fat preserves better than lean flesh, and smoked eel has an almost buttery richness that sustained people through hard winters with astonishing efficiency. The coarse fish, bream, roach, perch, tench, moved into the shallows in autumn to feed on the invertebrates that swarmed in the cooling water before the first frosts came. Pike, those magnificent, cold-eyed predators of medieval rivers, grew bold in autumn and could be taken on lines baited with smaller fish, their long bodies pulling hard against the hook. Even the freshwater crayfish, not a fish at all, but treated as such by medieval people and by the church, which classified all water-dwelling creatures together for dietary purposes, gathered under the flat stones of the riverbed in autumn and could be harvested in buckets from the shallows by anyone willing to work in cold water up to their knees. And then there was what was happening offshore, in the sea. 4 villages and towns anywhere near the coast, and in medieval Europe, with its enormous length of Atlantic and North Sea and Baltic coastline, and its rivers running deeply inland, near the coast described a very large proportion of the population autumn brought. The thing that made all other autumn fishing seem modest by comparison, the herring run. But we will reach the herring in its own chapter, because it deserves the full attention it never quite received from history. For now, let us stay with the river and its autumn abundance. And let us think carefully about what that abundance actually meant, and what it demanded of the people who received it. Because the gift of the river in autumn was not a simple gift. It came with conditions. It came with an urgency so extreme that it amounted to a kind of crisis, even in good years. And understanding that urgency is the key to understanding everything else. Fresh fish, any fresh fish, regardless of species, regardless of how it is handled, begins to spoil almost immediately after death. This is not medieval ignorance or modern squeamishness, it is basic biochemistry. Fish tissue contains bacteria that are adapted to cool environments and that begin the process of decomposition very rapidly at room temperature. Fish also contain certain enzymes in their gut that begin to break down the flesh from the inside almost as soon as the fish dies. And fish, unlike many other animal foods, have a very high water content. The very quality that makes fresh fish so delicate and delicious also makes it extraordinarily perishable. In a world without refrigeration, a fresh fish was a problem as much as it was a gift. On a warm autumn day, an early autumn could still bring warm days, the last gasp of summer. What we now call an Indian summer, a fish left ungutted and uncured might be substantially spoiled within hours, even on a cold day, even gutted and kept in a cool place. A fresh fish was unlikely to remain wholesome beyond 2 days, perhaps 3 at the absolute outside, and the river was giving you hundreds of fish at a time, thousands, on the good days, far more than the village could eat fresh, and the fish would not wait for you to finish eating them before they began to die. This was the fundamental problem of autumn fishing in the medieval world, and it was a problem that required a solution of matching scale, not the preservation of a few fish for a few days. The preservation of hundreds or thousands of fish for weeks, months, the entire length of a winter that might run from November to March or beyond. The gap between what was needed and what was naturally possible, between the brief season of abundance and the long season of need, was so enormous that it had driven human ingenuity for literally thousands of years before the medieval period began. The solutions that humanity had developed in response to this problem were, by the time of our medieval village, ancient and well understood. They were not the product of scientific experimentation or theoretical reasoning, but of long, painful, iterative experience of generations of people trying different things, observing what worked and what didn't, suffering the consequences of what didn't, and passing on what worked with the earnestness of people who knew that the knowledge they were transmitting was the difference between eating and not eating in February. Salt was one answer. Salt, applied generously to fish flesh, drew the water out of it through osmosis and created an environment in which the bacteria responsible for decay found it difficult or impossible to thrive. Salted fish, properly done, could last for weeks, enough to carry a family from the peak of the autumn catch through the early part of winter. But salt was expensive. Salt was, in the medieval world, a commodity so valuable it was sometimes used as currency, sometimes used to pay wages, always taxed by whoever had the power to tax it. A village that wanted to salt its fish needed to acquire salt, and acquiring salt required money, or goods, or the kind of political connections to a salt merchant that most peasant communities simply did not have in sufficient quantities to salt everything they caught. Drying was another answer. Fish could be laid out on rocks or hung on wooden frames in the open air and allowed to dry in the wind and the sun until the moisture was almost entirely removed from the flesh, leaving a hard, dense, shelf-stable product that could last for months. The Norse perfected this into an art form with their stockfish, great Atlantic cod split, and hung on wooden racks by the fjords. drying in the cold Arctic wind for months, until they were as hard as boards and as light as parchment. But drying required the right weather: cold, dry, consistently windy, and the autumn weather of most of northern Europe was not reliably cold and dry. It was wet. It was damp. It was exactly the wrong kind of weather for drying fish in the open air, because dampness encouraged exactly the mold and bacterial growth that drying was supposed to prevent. Smoking was the answer that combined the benefits of both approaches while mitigating the limitations of each. The heat of the smokehouse helped to dry the fish, removing moisture without requiring favorable outdoor conditions. The chemical compounds in the smoke, the phenols, the aldehydes, the organic acids released by the combustion of hardwood, provided powerful antimicrobial protection that supplemented and extended the preservative work of the salt. And smoking required something that the medieval village had in essentially unlimited supply: wood. Wood from the great surrounding forest, carefully chosen for the qualities it would impart, managed and harvested as part of the village's year-round relationship with the trees at its back. The river gave the fish, the forest gave the wood. The accumulated wisdom of generations gave the knowledge of how to bring them together in the right way. And every autumn, when the fish ran and the weather turned and the days began their long retreat toward the solstice, the village did what it had always done. It took the river's last gift, its greatest gift, its most urgent and perishable gift, and it answered that gift with fire. Not fire that destroyed, fire that preserved, fire that extended, fire that carried the abundance of the autumn river forward through the dark months and released it again, a piece at a time, against the long hunger of winter. That is what the smoke was for. That is what the autumn fires in the old black building at the edge of the forest were always for. Chapter 3. The smokehouse at the edge of the wood. The smokehouse was usually the oldest building in the village. Not the most impressive, not the most carefully built, not the one that received the most attention or repair, but the oldest, the building that had been there the longest, whose timbers had been darkened and hardened by decades of use into something that almost seemed to transcend the ordinary life cycle of wood, which rots and splinters and eventually returns to the earth from which it came. The timbers of a well-used smokehouse did not seem to be on their way back to the earth. They seemed, if anything, to have become something more permanent than ordinary wood, something closer to stone, or to the dark soil of the forest floor that has been compacted and compressed by 1,000 years of fallen leaves, until it is almost like peat. This is not mere impression. The compounds deposited in wood by long exposure to smoke, the same phenols and aldehydes that preserved the fish, also preserved the timber itself. A smokehouse that had been in continuous use for a generation or two was, in a very literal chemical sense, a building that had cured itself from the inside out. Its timbers would resist rot, resist insect damage, resist the ordinary processes of decay that claimed ordinary wooden buildings within a few decades. And so the smokehouse stood, while other buildings fell and were rebuilt around it, growing ever darker and ever more permanent looking, taking on the quality of something that had always been there and always would be, as fixed a feature of the village landscape as the well or the mill or the church. Walk up to it, and the first thing you notice is the smell, even when the fires are not lit, even in the depths of summer when the building stands empty and cold. The smell clings to the timbers and seeps from the cracks in the walls and rises from the earth floor inside, which is black with the residue of generations of fires and soaked with the drippings of centuries of curing fish. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is deep and complex and slightly sweet in the way of old wood, layered with something sharper and more mineral, something that prickles the back of the nose and sits at the edge of flavor without quite becoming food. It is the smell of the building's long history of useful work, preserved in the wood, just as the smoke preserved the fish that hung inside it. The building itself is small by almost any standard, perhaps 10 or 12 feet in one direction and 15 or 18 in another, though the dimensions varied greatly from village to village and from century to century. The walls are low, the roof steeply pitched to shed the rain, the thatch or shingles above it darkened to near black by the smoke that must find its way out somehow, seeping up through the thatch or escaping through the gaps between the roof timbers rather than through any proper chimney or vent. This lack of a proper chimney is deliberate. The smoke is not the waste product of a fire whose purpose is heat, to be got rid of as efficiently as possible. The smoke is the point. The smoke is what is being managed, what is being cultivated and directed, what is doing the essential work. A chimney that drew it away too quickly would be counterproductive. The air inside the smokehouse during an active cure must be thick, almost impenetrably thick, a warm amber murk through which the hanging fish are barely visible, their forms softened to silhouettes by the haze. The door is low, lower than seems comfortable for an adult, so that you must duck your head to enter. This is partly a function of the low walls, and partly deliberate. A low door loses less of the precious warm smoky air each time it is opened. The latch is a simple wooden peg. There are no windows, or perhaps one very small opening high in the wall, more gap than window, through which a blade of outdoor light enters and shows you the motes of smoke and ash floating in the interior air. The floor is earthen, beaten, hard and black, with a central pit perhaps 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide where the fire is built. This pit is old, dug so long ago that its edges have been worn smooth by generations of use, and the earth around it is so thoroughly carbonized that it almost seems to be made of something other than soil. From the ceiling hang the hooks and racks on which the fish will cure. The hooks are iron, beaten out at the village smithy, simple escurved things that can hold a fish skewered through its tail or gill. The racks are hazel withies, flexible young branches bent into hoops or woven into flat frames on which smaller fish can be laid, or from which they can be suspended on strings of twisted plant fiber. In a large commercial smokehouse, the ceiling might be hung with many hundreds of hooks arranged in rows on horizontal poles, capable of holding an almost unimaginable number of fish in various stages of cure. In a small village smokehouse, the capacity might be more modest, enough to process the catch of several families over the course of the autumn, working in shifts so that the fire was never entirely out and the curing was continuous throughout the season. The fire itself burns in the pit below the hanging fish. It burns differently from an ordinary cooking fire or a heating fire. An ordinary fire is tended to produce heat and flame. You want it to burn hot and clean, to give you the highest energy output from the wood you feed it. A smoking fire is tended to produce smoke. You want it to burn cool and slow, smoldering rather than flaming, producing the maximum quantity of that heavy, particular, chemical-laden smoke that does the preserving work. This means feeding it with specific kinds of wood in specific conditions, not dry, split kindling that will burn bright and fast, but larger pieces of hardwood, sometimes slightly green, laid carefully so that the fire smolders and creeps rather than blazing. The firekeeper in a smokehouse was doing something that required constant, experienced attention, adding wood at the right rate, adjusting the airflow through the pit to keep the temperature in the right range, responding to changes in weather and humidity that affected the way the fire burned. Too much heat and the fish would cook rather than cure, losing the keeping qualities that were the whole point. Too little and the smoke would thin, the preservative compounds failing to penetrate the flesh, the cure incomplete, and the fish destined to spoil before winter's end. It is worth spending a moment with the question of which wood was used, because in the medieval village this was a matter of serious practical knowledge rather than casual preference. The received wisdom accumulated over generations, and almost certainly correct in its essentials, was that only hardwood would do. The great hardwood trees of the European forest, oak, above all others, for its density and the quality of the smoke it produced, beech, close behind, for the clean and slightly nutty character it gave to the cured flesh, alder, which grew abundantly along the riverside and produced a particularly fragrant smoke well suited to fish, apple and pear and other fruitwoods when they were available, giving a sweetness to the cure that was highly prized, ash for its reliable, even burn, hornbeam for its extraordinary density and heat. What was absolutely prohibited, and this prohibition was understood by everyone who worked with smoke, understood as thoroughly and as uncomplicatedly as the prohibition on using rotten fish, was the use of coniferous wood, pine, fir, spruce, larch, the resinous softwoods that made up large portions of the northern European forest. These burned hot and fast, which was wrong for a smoking fire. But more importantly, they produced a resinous, bitter smoke full of compounds that gave the cured fish a deeply unpleasant, turpentine-like flavor that could not be disguised or cooked away. A batch of fish smoked over pine was not merely inferior to a batch smoked over oak. It was, in the practical terms of the village economy, ruined. A ruined batch was not a misfortune to be shrugged off. It was a genuine threat to the winter's food supply, and the person responsible for it would have faced the collective displeasure of everyone who was depending on those fish to eat in February. The wood was therefore chosen with care, and the choosing was part of the expertise of the people who managed the smokehouse. Oak from the managed woodland around the village, cut in the right season when the sap was down and the wood dense. Alder from the riverbank, where it grew in abundance and could be coppiest on a rotation, cut back hard and allowed to regrow, producing a steady supply of young straight poles that were perfect smokehouse fuel. Apple prunings from the orchard, saved from the winter's tree work and stored dry through the following year. All of this was part of the village's careful management of its own resources, the same careful management that determined how many animals could graze the common pasture without degrading it, how much timber could be taken from the forest each year without diminishing it, how much fish could be taken from the river without emptying it. Because here is another thing worth understanding about the medieval village and its relationship to the natural systems on which it depended. It had to manage those systems sustainably, or it would die. This was not environmental ethics in any modern sense. It was not philosophy. It was basic self-interest operating over the relevant timescale. A village that overfished its river would find itself with fewer fish the next autumn, and fewer still the autumn after that, and eventually none at all. A village that stripped its woodland for fuel would find itself short of timber for building and firewood for warmth and smokehouse fuel and all the other essential uses of wood that the medieval world ran on. The feedback loops between the village and its natural environment were short and brutal and unmistakable, and communities that failed to respect them did not persist. The smokehouse, then, stood at the center of a whole web of sustainable relationships with the river, with the forest, with the accumulated knowledge of how to manage both. It was not merely a building, it was an institution, in the deepest sense, a structure of practice and knowledge and social organization that the village had built up over time to address a fundamental problem of its existence, the problem of time, the problem of abundance in the present and scarcity in the future, the problem of how to take what is here now and make it available later, across the gap of the ungiving months. And the children who pressed their faces to the gaps in the planking and watched the fish hanging in the amber haze, they were not merely watching a quaint old custom, they were watching the technology that kept them alive. They were watching their future unfold in the slow, patient, fragrant darkness of the oldest building in the village, and breathing it in through their noses and storing it in their memories, ready for the day when they would be the ones feeding the fire and checking the cure and teaching their own children to press their faces to the gaps in the planking and watch. Chapter 4. Salt and its Secrets. Before the fish ever saw the smoke, it first met the salt, and this encounter, this meeting between perishable flesh and ancient mineral, was not a simple or a casual thing. It was the first act of a preservation process that had to be carried out with precision and with knowledge, and it took place in the context of one of the most extraordinary and underappreciated economic facts of the medieval world. That salt, which we now use so freely that we think nothing of it, was in the Middle Ages among the most precious and politically consequential substances on earth. Let us begin with the salt itself, because it is worth understanding what it actually was and where it came from. Since for most people in a medieval inland village, it arrived as a traded commodity, something bought or bartered for, not something made, and the distance it had traveled before it reached their hands was often considerable. Salt in medieval Europe came from several principal sources. Coastal communities could produce it themselves by evaporating seawater in shallow salt pans, broad, deflat flat enclosures built at the edge of the sea where the tide could be admitted and then trapped. The water slowly evaporating under the wind and the sun, to leave behind a crust of salt crystals that were raked up and bagged and sent to market. This was the great salt industry of the Bay of Biscay, of the French Atlantic coast around the Gironde marshes and the Isle de Roth, of the shallow coastal lagoons of the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. It was also practiced on a smaller scale along virtually every coastline in Europe where the tidal conditions and the climate permitted. The salt produced this way was coarse and grey and impure, mineral-rich in a way that was, in fact, not undesirable for curing purposes, since the trace minerals contributed something to both the flavour and the preservative process, and it was produced in very large quantities when conditions were right. Further inland, salt came from the mining of rock salt, vast underground deposits of halite, the crystalline mineral form of sodium chloride, laid down millions of years ago when ancient seas dried out and left their dissolved minerals behind. The great rock salt mines of Central Europe, in what are now Poland, Austria, and Germany, were among the most economically important sites in the medieval world, giving rise to fortunes, to trade routes, to towns that would not otherwise have existed. The name Salzburg Salt Castle tells you everything you need to know about what founded that city's wealth. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, still open to visitors today, was being worked in the Middle Ages to produce salt that traveled across the continent. The Salzkammergut region of Austria was, quite literally, the chamber of salt, the treasury region from which salt revenues funded the Habsburg treasury, and there were brine springs, places where underground salt deposits had dissolved in water, and that water was rising to the surface. Brine seeping from the earth in streams of varying salinity that could be collected and evaporated to produce salt. The town of Droitwich in England had been a salt production centre since before the Romans came, its brine springs so concentrated that the salt almost crystallized out of the water on its own. Nantwich, Middlewich, Northwich, all the wich towns of the English Midlands owe their names and their medieval significance to the Old English word for saltworks, wyche, and to the brine springs around which their economies were built. All of this production was, by the standards of what medieval communities needed, both abundant and, paradoxically, never quite enough. Salt was essential for every aspect of food preservation in a world without refrigeration, for curing meat, for preserving vegetables in brine, for making cheese, for curing hides, for a dozen other purposes besides the curing of fish, and the demand for it was seasonal, spiking dramatically in autumn when the preservation of the harvests, surplus, animal and vegetable, and aquatic, all happened at once. The autumn salt market was a frenzy of acquisition, and the price reflected the urgency of the buyers. The taxation of salt was one of the great financial instruments of medieval governance. Because salt was essential and non-substitutable, there was no alternative, no workaround, no way to do without it. It was what economists would now call an inelastic commodity, meaning that people would pay whatever was asked for it because they had no choice. Governments understood this with perfect clarity and exploited it accordingly. The French gabelle, the royal salt tax, was one of the most hated imposts in French history, imposing a mandatory purchase of a minimum quantity of salt from royal monopoly suppliers at prices set by the crown, regardless of need or means. It was still being collected, in various mutated forms, right up to the French Revolution, and its abolition was one of the specific grievances listed in the Cas de Doléances, the books of complaint submitted by French commoners in 1789. Salt could make kings rich and drive peasants to fury. It was that important. For the medieval village preparing for the autumn fish cure, acquiring sufficient salt was therefore not a trivial task. It required planning ahead, knowing roughly how large a catch the autumn might bring, and therefore how much salt would be needed, and beginning to lay in supplies well before the fishing season peaked, because waiting until you needed it meant paying the highest prices at the moment of highest demand. It required resources salt had to be paid for, in coin or in kind, and for communities that operated largely on barter, this meant having something of sufficient value to offer the salt merchant or the salt carter who brought it to the weekly market. And it required storage. Salt absorbed moisture from the air and clumped and degraded if not kept dry, which meant that a proper salt store, sealed against damp, was part of the equipment of any household or community that intended to do serious curing. The knowledge of how much salt to use was, like so many aspects of the smoking operation, a form of embodied expertise developed over generations and transmitted through practice rather than instruction. Too little salt in the initial cure, and the fish would not be adequately dehydrated before hanging in the smokehouse. It might begin to spoil from the inside before the smoke had time to do its protective work on the outside. Too much salt and the outer layers of the flesh would harden into an almost impermeable crust through which the smoke could not penetrate, or the final product would be so intensely, inedibly salty that it required days of soaking to become fit for the table, an acceptable outcome in some traditions and for some products, but not always what was wanted. The balance point between these failure modes was narrow, and finding it required the kind of tacit knowledge that cannot be fully articulated, the kind that lives in the hands and the judgment of the person doing the work rather than in any set of rules. The process began as soon as the fish came from the water. Speed was of the essence, not because the fish spoiled instantly, but because every hour of delay was an hour of spoilage advancing. And the gap between a fish that cured perfectly and a fish that cured badly could be measured in hours as much as in method. The fish were gutted first, which served two purposes. It removed the gut bacteria that were the primary engine of rapid internal spoilage, and it opened the body cavity so that the salt could penetrate more thoroughly to the thickest parts of the flesh. The gutting was done quickly, with short, sharp knives honed to a degree of sharpness that we associate now with surgical instruments rather than kitchen tools. A skilled gutter, and in a coastal fishing community during the herring season, the gutters were specialists who spent the entire autumn doing nothing else, working from before dawn to after dusk, moved in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic to watch, the knife entering the fish at exactly the right point, the single drawing cut opening the belly, the other hand clearing the entrails in one smooth movement, the gutted fish tossed into the salt trough in a motion that was the natural continuation of the same gesture. The speed at which this was done was not merely impressive as a display of skill, it was functionally important. Every fish had to be gutted and salted within hours of being caught, and when the catch numbered in the thousands, the speed of processing was a genuine bottleneck. After gutting came the salting. The fish were laid in layers in a wooden trough or a great earthenware crock, each layer generously covered with coarse salt. The ratio of salt to fish, the thickness of the layers, the duration of the initial salt cure before smoking, all of this varied by tradition, by the type of fish being cured, by the intended use of the final product, and by the accumulated practice of the particular community doing the work. What did not vary was the basic mechanism. The salt drew moisture from the fish flesh through osmosis, creating a briny liquid, the pickle, that formed around the fish and contributed further to the hostile environment for bacteria. The longer the fish spent in the salt, the drier and denser the flesh would become, and the more resistant to spoilage it would be after smoking. For fish that were to be smoked immediately and consumed within a few months, a shorter salt cure might suffice, a matter of hours or a day. For fish that were to be kept for the full length of winter, or that were intended for trade, and the long journeys that trade implied, a longer and more thorough cure was required, sometimes several days in the salt before the smoking began. The fish coming out dense and firm and darker in color, their flesh already beginning to take on the translucent quality that long curing produced. It is worth pausing here to think about what the salt was actually doing to the fish, because understanding the mechanism illuminates why this process was so effective and why it developed. Independently, in food preservation cultures all over the world, the cells of fish flesh contain water. About 70 to 80% of the weight of fresh fish is water. Bacteria that cause spoilage need this water to thrive. They need the moisture of the tissue as the medium in which their biochemical processes take place. Salt, when applied to fish flesh, does something extraordinarily effective. It creates a zone of high osmotic pressure outside the cells, drawing water out of the cell membranes in an attempt to equalize the concentration. The fish flesh loses moisture, shrinking and firming as it does, and the environment around the fish becomes so salty, so inhospitable to bacterial life, that the organisms responsible for decay either cannot survive or can reproduce only very slowly. Salt also works directly on the proteins of the fish flesh, denaturing them in ways that help to stabilize the texture and color of the cured fish. A properly salt-cured fish has a firmer, denser texture than fresh fish, a deeper and more concentrated flavor, and a preserved quality that is not merely the absence of spoilage, but a genuine transformation. The salt has done something to the fish that cannot be undone, creating a new product with its own character and its own culinary possibilities. Medieval people understood none of this in biochemical terms, but they understood the outcome completely, and they had refined their practice to produce that outcome with a consistency that is quite remarkable, given the variability of their raw materials and the imprecision of their tools. They could not measure the salinity of their pickle in parts per million. They could not test the water activity of their cured fish. They could not peer through a microscope to check for bacterial contamination. What they could do was look at the fish, feel the fish, smell the fish, and judge from all of these sensory inputs whether the cure was proceeding correctly, whether more time was needed, whether the batch was good, or whether something had gone wrong. This judgment, built from years of practice and sharpened by the consequences of error, was the equivalent, in practical terms, in terms of the outcomes it produced, of a great deal of modern food science. It was slower to acquire and impossible to transmit in writing, but it was real knowledge, and it worked. The final element of the salt story that deserves attention is its flavor contribution. Salted and smoked fish is not merely preserved fish, it is transformed fish, a food with its own distinctive character that is quite different from fresh fish. In the same way that cured ham is quite different from fresh pork, or that aged cheese is quite different from fresh milk, the salt concentrates the flavors of the fish flesh, bringing out a depth and umami richness that fresh fish does not have. The particular mineral character of the coarse medieval salt, rich in magnesium and calcium and other trace elements that are stripped out of modern refined salt, contributed something to this flavor that modern reproductions using ultra-pure sodium chloride cannot quite replicate, and the interaction of the salt cure with the subsequent smoking created the specific, irreplaceable character of the final product, the particular savory, smoky, deep, complex flavor of smoked herring, or smoked eel or cold smoked salmon that has been prized and sought and imitated for thousands of years. This is what salt did. It preserved, yes, but preservation was not the whole of it. Salt also, in combination with time and smoke, made something delicious, and perhaps that is the deeper secret of the salt's role in the medieval autumn. That necessity, practiced long enough with sufficient skill and attention, has a way of becoming art. Chapter 5. What the cold cannot stop. There is a question that hangs in the air of every conversation about medieval food preservation, and it is a reasonable question, asked from the perspective of our modern understanding of refrigeration and cold storage. The question is simply this: if the problem was keeping food from spoiling, and if winter brought cold, genuine, sustained, bone-biting cold across most of northern and central Europe, then why not simply use the cold? Why not let winter itself do the work that we now give to electricity and compressors and carefully calibrated refrigeration units? Why smoke? Why salt? Why all this labor and expense, when winter arrived reliably every year and was, in its way, the world's largest refrigerator? It is a fair question, and the answer to it reveals something important, not only about the practical realities of medieval life, but about the nature of the problem that food preservation was actually trying to solve. A problem that is, in its essence, a problem about time and reliability, about the gap between what nature provides and what human communities need. The first part of the answer is meteorological, and it is more complicated than it might initially appear. Medieval winters across northern Europe were not the uniform, reliably frozen seasons of a children's picture book. They were variable, unpredictable, and in many regions of the continent and the British Isles, frequently not cold enough for the reliable, prolonged deep freeze that food storage in the open would require. England, with its maritime climate moderated by the Gulf Stream, experienced winters that were often wet and mild, cold enough to be miserable, certainly, but frequently not cold enough to freeze solid and stay frozen. A winter in much of England might see temperatures hovering just above freezing for days at a time, with occasional hard frosts and occasional thaws, producing conditions that were almost perfectly calibrated to encourage the worst aspects of spoilage. Cold enough to slow bacterial action, but not cold enough to stop it, followed by warm spells during which spoilage proceeded rapidly, followed by warm spallage, spollage by pallage, spollage per pallage, beleded, bowdy, clod, belly keep with, pork with, fat, with, fro, with, whipper the saw, imip, pass lock, purple with a hat, clo, hat out, with the hat, plug, mip up, bar, pet cock up, gratat, out, asa, akat, peft, go, akas, avoid, with it with heart, bullet, but with roast liquid, to a fox, bread, even in the colder winters of continental Europe, in Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, the regions that regularly saw sustained hard frosts, the variability remained a problem. A week of temperatures well below freezing might be followed by a midwinter thaw. A few days of unseasonable warmth that was a common enough feature of European winters that it had a name and a folk association. The spell of mild weather in January, sometimes called St. Hilary's summer, or various regional equivalents. During such a thaw, any food stored in an outdoor or semi-outdoor location that depended on the ambient temperature to stay frozen might begin to thaw itself, and thawed meat or fish that then refroze was not in good condition. The ice crystals that formed as it froze had ruptured many of the cell walls, and when it thawed again, the cellular fluids drained away, taking much of the nutritional value and structural integrity with them, and leaving behind a product that was more vulnerable to spoilage than the original unfrozen food had been. There is also a simpler and more immediate problem with relying on outdoor cold storage: access. Food buried under snow or left outside in a frozen landscape was not readily accessible. In the depths of winter, in regions of heavy snowfall, Simply reaching your stored supplies might require significant effort, digging through drifts, breaking through ice, traveling to the outdoor cache, through conditions that could be genuinely dangerous. The convenience of indoor storage, of a smoked fish hanging from the rafter of the cottage, reachable without leaving the warmth and light of the single heated room, was not a trivial consideration in a world where outdoor conditions in winter could be severe. Going outside in a medieval winter, without proper waterproof clothing, without insulated footwear, without the thermal underlayers that we now take for granted, was not the minor expedition it is for us. It was a genuine cold exposure with genuine consequences, especially for the young and the elderly and the already weak. But there is a deeper and more interesting dimension to this question that goes beyond the merely meteorological. The question assumes that the problem to be solved was simply the spoilage of food between autumn and spring, a purely local problem, solved locally by whatever means were available in the immediate environment, and for a single family in a single location, with a fixed quantity of food to last through a single winter. This framing has some validity. Yes, if you lived somewhere cold enough and you had a secure, frost-proof, animal-proof cache, you might be able to freeze your autumn fish and retrieve them through the winter. But this was not, in fact, the problem that the medieval world needed to solve. The medieval world needed to solve a much larger and more complex problem, the problem of food distribution across space as well as time. And this is where the limitations of freezing as a preservation strategy become most stark. Frozen food cannot be traded, it cannot be shipped. It cannot be carried on a cart for 3 days to a market town and sold to a buyer who will carry it for another 3 days to a monastery or a garrison or a town that has no river and no fish of its own. It cannot be loaded onto a ship and transported around the coast or across the channel. It cannot be stored at a merchant's warehouse and sold in batches through the winter as the market demands. Frozen food is static, fragile, dependent on continuous cold, and it melts. Smoked and salted fish is none of these things. It is stable at room temperature for months. It is hard and dry and compact. A smoked herring takes up a fraction of the space of a fresh herring and weighs much less. It can be stacked and packed and transported in barrels or on carts or in the holds of ships, by land and by sea, over any distance and through any weather. It can be bought and sold and stored and sold again. It can be taxed because it moves through tolls and markets and ports of entry in a way that can be monitored and charged. It is, in the language of economics, a tradable good, and tradability was enormously important in the medieval world. Consider the geography of medieval food supply for a moment. The great fish of autumn were concentrated at the coasts and along the major rivers. The great populations of medieval Europe were increasingly urbanized, not in the modern sense, but concentrated in market towns, in the great cathedral cities, in the fortified towns around which the administrative and ecclesiastical life of the continent was organized. Many of these towns had little or no local fishing. Many of them were far from any river capable of sustaining significant fish populations. They depended for their fish supply, and, given the church's fasting requirements, they depended on it heavily, on a supply chain that extended from the coastal fisheries and the great river fisheries through a network of traders and carriers and wholesale merchants that was, by the high medieval period, of considerable sophistication and scale. The fish that fed Paris in winter came partly from the Seine and its tributaries, but also in substantial quantities from the Norman coast and from more distant fisheries connected to the city by road and river. The fish that fed the great cities of inland Germany came via the Hanseatic trade networks, originating in the North Sea and Baltic fisheries, and traveling overland through a web of market towns and toll roads. The fish that fed the monasteries of England's interior came from the coastal ports of the East Coast and from the great rivers of the Midlands, cured and packed and shipped in ways that allowed them to travel for days or weeks without spoilage. None of this supply chain could have functioned with frozen fish. All of it depended on preserved fish, smoked, salted, dried, or some combination of all three. The preservation of fish in autumn was therefore not merely a domestic act of a village feeding itself through the winter. It was the foundation of a continental food economy, a supply system that connected the sea to the city, the abundance of the fishing grounds to the need of the urban populations, across distances and timescales that would have been impossible without the technologies of salt and smoke. And there is still another dimension to consider, one that is easy to overlook, but that was central to the thinking of every medieval person who contemplated the winter ahead: the question of nutrition. We know now, in ways that medieval people did not, that cold preserved food retains its nutritional content much better than food that has been through the salt and smoke process. Modern nutrition science would tell us that fresh frozen fish is, in a strict technical sense, nutritionally superior to smoked and salted fish, which has lost significant amounts of certain vitamins and whose salt content creates its own health issues. But medieval people did not think in terms of vitamins and micronutrients. They thought in terms of what sustained them, what gave them strength, what kept them from the weakness and disease that followed periods of inadequate eating. And in these terms, smoked and salted fish was an extraordinarily effective food, dense in protein and fat, providing exactly the sustained caloric and nutritional support that cold, labor-intensive medieval winters demanded. The strong, concentrated flavor of cured fish also meant that a relatively small quantity of it could serve as the protein component of a meal. A single smoked herring, stretched with broth and root vegetables, could feed a family with something better than nothing. And nothing, the absence of any preserved animal protein through the long cold months, was the alternative that haunted every medieval winter's calculations. The cold could stop many things. It could slow the pace of work, and the growth of crops, and the movement of commerce. It could stop the river from running, and the fields from being ploughed. It could stop a child's warmth, and, if the winter was hard enough, and the preparation had been inadequate, it could stop life itself. But it could not, by itself, solve the problem of how to feed a community through the months when nothing was growing and the river was locked in ice and the world had contracted to the small circle of warmth around a single fire. Only the smoke could do that. Only the ancient combination of salt and fire and hardwood and thyme could take the river's autumn bounty and carry it forward reliably, portably, tradably, through every kind of winter that northern Europe could produce. Right up to the moment in late spring when the ice broke and the fish ran again and the world opened back up like a hand, and the cold was a fact of medieval life, important and ever-present and deeply shaping of everything it touched. But it was not a technology. It was not something that could be reliably deployed and managed and directed to the purpose of keeping a community fed. The smoke was a technology, ancient, refined, collective, and extraordinarily effective. And in the competition between these two approaches to the problem of winter, the smoke won, every time, in every village, across every autumn of the medieval millennium. Chapter 6, The Herring Run. Of all the creatures that swam in the cold waters of medieval Europe, none was more important to the feeding of the continent than the Atlantic herring. Not the cod, which would later become the great fish of the age of exploration. Not the salmon, which was noble and prized. Not the eel, which was local and ubiquitous. The herring, small, silver, shoaling in numbers that strained the medieval capacity for large quantities, was the fish that held medieval Europe together through its winters. The protein at the base of a food system that stretched from the fishing boats of the North Sea to the tables of landlocked cities, hundreds of miles from saltwater. To understand why, you have to understand what the herring actually was and is as a biological entity. Because the herring's way of being in the world, its behavior, its ecology, its relationship to the sea and to the seasons, was the engine that drove the entire late medieval fish economy. The herring is a shoaling fish. It does not live alone or in small groups, but in enormous aggregations called schools or shoals that may contain hundreds of millions of individuals, moving together through the upper layers of the ocean in formations so dense that they appear, from above, like a single vast silver organism shifting and rippling through the water. The shoaling behavior is a defense against predation. It is harder for a predator to single out and capture an individual fish from a great mass of moving fish than from a small group, but it is for classically of cassable than from the small group, but it has the remarkable consequence from the human perspectives of consequates of consecrator, in consecrate betencro, consecrating grecoe cansit kin kak rexenskent bucanic cat and prega catagagid tav force at the plebet pap it happened at dasque with hap up have a dep but have to have lopat at her so was a gasa a school a gag that sukas bad to have the fast saf go the wolf was gespookiest schools experienced best wolf was and the herring was predictable. This is the crucial fact, the fact that made the herring industry possible and that made the herring so central to the medieval economy. The shoals moved according to rhythms that, while not perfectly clockwork, were reliable enough across years and decades to be planned around, to support a whole superstructure of boats and nets and salt and smokehouses and markets and merchants and church fasting calendars. Each autumn, the great herring shoals gathered in the waters of the North Sea and the Baltic, moving through predictable zones in predictable sequences, and the fishing fleets of 5 nations converged on them in what was, for the medieval period, an industrial operation of remarkable scale. The herring spawned in autumn, another crucial fact. They moved into the shallower coastal waters where spawning took place, and in these shallower waters they were more vulnerable to the nets of the fishing boats than they were in the open ocean. The roe-heavy females and the milk-running males were fat at this season, fattened on the summer's plankton blooms, carrying reserves of oil in their flesh that served their own purposes, energy for spawning, energy for winter, but that also made them better eating and better curing than herring taken at any other time of year. An autumn herring, taken from a spawning shoal in the North Sea, was as fat and rich and suitable for smoking as a herring could be. The timing of the herring's biology aligned perfectly with the timing of the human need. Autumn was when the villagers needed fish to smoke, and autumn was when the fish were most numerous and most suitable for smoking. The great herring fisheries of the medieval North Sea were concentrated in 2 main regions, and the story of each is its own chapter of economic history. The first was the waters off the Scanian coast, what is now the southern tip of Sweden, then part of Denmark, where every autumn herring appeared in such extraordinary numbers that the medieval Scandinavians had a word for the phenomenon that translates, roughly, as herring weather, the particular combination of sea conditions, of wind and temperature and current, that indicated the fish had arrived. The Scanian Herring Fair, held each autumn at the town of Skana and other nearby ports, was one of the great commercial events of the medieval Baltic world. Merchants from the Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of northern German and Baltic cities, dominated this fair, arriving with enormous quantities of salt from the mines of Central Europe and departing with barrels of salted herring that would feed the cities of the German interior through the winter. The scale of this trade was staggering. In its peak years in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Scanian Fair processed hundreds of thousands of barrels of herring annually, an output that dwarfs the largest modern fishing operations in terms of its significance to the communities it fed. The second great fishery was in the waters of the southern North Sea, particularly off the East Anglian coast of England, and its focal point was the town of Great Yarmouth, a place so shaped by the herring trade that it is almost impossible to understand Yarmouth's medieval history without understanding the fish that built it. The Yarmouth Herring Fair lasted for 40 days each autumn, running from the Feast of Michaelmas on the 29th of September, itself a date of enormous medieval significance, being the beginning of the accounting year and one of the great quarter days, through to Martinmas on the 11th of November. For those 40 days, Yarmouth was transformed from a modest coastal town into one of the busiest commercial centres in England. The boats began arriving from late September, when the herring shoals first appeared in the southern waters. They came from all along the English east coast, from Scarborough and Whitby in the north, from Lynn and Boston further south, from the small fishing villages of Norfolk and Suffolk, whose entire economic life was organised around the autumn herring season. They came from further afield too. Boats from Flanders and from Normandy and from Brittany crossed the Channel to fish in the English waters, paying dues to the English crown for the privilege, but finding the effort worthwhile because the herring in these waters were so numerous and the market at Yarmouth so large. The harbour-filled beach was lined with boats drawn up above the tide line. The air over the town was thick with the smell of fish and salt and smoke, a smell so pervasive and so characteristic that it was simply the smell of Yarmouth in autumn, as normal and unremarkable to the people who lived there as the smell of bread from a baker's. The processing began on the boats themselves, where the crew worked without stopping through the fishing watches, gutting and cleaning the fish as they came over the side. Then the herring were brought ashore and passed to the gutters and the salters who worked in long rows on the beach, processing thousands of fish per hour in a continuous, numbing, essential operation. The gutted, salted fish went into barrels, great oak barrels, themselves a significant industry, requiring skilled coopers working year-round to produce the quantities needed to be carried away by the merchants who had come to the fair from across England and the continent to buy. Some of the Yarmouth herring went straight into barrels of salt, for the trade in salt herring that supplied the interior markets. but a substantial portion went into the smokehouses, of which Yarmouth had many ranged along the landward side of the town, in the area still called the Rows, narrow lanes that gave onto the smokehouses and curing sheds behind them. In these smokehouses, the herring were hung in the dense smoke of burning wood and cured for a period that produced what became perhaps the most famous smoked fish product in English history, the red herring. The red herring, so called for the deep copper-red color that long smoking over hard wood gave to the skin and flesh, was not the lightly smoked, delicate thing that we associate with the word kipper today. It was a heavily smoked, intensely cured product that had been subjected to much more aggressive treatment, often several days in the salt, followed by several more days in a very smoky fire, producing a fish that was almost black on the outside and a rich reddish-brown inside, very dry, very firm, and possessed of a flavor so strong and concentrated that a single fish, properly reconstituted and cooked, could serve as the protein element of a substantial meal. This intensity was not a flaw, it was the point. A red herring that had been properly made would keep for months, 6 months, in good conditions, possibly more. It could travel anywhere. It could survive any ordinary abuse of storage and transport. It was, in the language of modern logistics, an extraordinarily resilient product, and the medieval world loved it for exactly this reason. The great question of medieval fish economics was always the same. How do you get the fish from where it is caught to where it needs to be eaten, without it spoiling on the way? The distances involved were, by the standards of a world in which the only transport was human and animal muscle and wind-powered sail, genuinely enormous. From Yarmouth to London was a journey of several days by road or boat. From London to the Midlands was another several days. From the coast to the monasteries and manors of the English interior was a supply chain that, end to end, might cover 150 or 200 miles a week's travel by cart on roads that were, in autumn, often rivers of mud. A fresh herring could not make this journey. A red herring could make it and arrive in good condition, and be worth the same price at the end of the journey as at the beginning. It is for this reason, the matchless keeping quality of the properly smoked herring, that the red herring became a trade good of continental significance. We have records of smoked herring from English fisheries reaching markets as distant as Poland and Bohemia, carried along the trade routes of the Hanseatic League, through the cities and river systems of northern Germany. We have records of English herring being supplied to armies on campaign in France and to crusading fleets in the Mediterranean. We have records of smoked herring specified in the provisions lists of English monasteries from the far north to the south coast, all of it sourced ultimately from the autumn fisheries of the North Sea, all of it preserved in smoke and salt to make the journey possible. The sheer scale of the demand that this trade represented helps to explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling. Why the medieval church was so insistent, for so many centuries, about the obligation of fasting on Fridays and during Lent, and on the other prescribed days of abstinence. It is easy, from a modern secular perspective, to read these requirements purely as theological impositions, as the Church, exercising its control over the bodies and habits of the faithful in the service of spiritual discipline. And this was certainly part of the intention. But the effect of these requirements was also, and simultaneously, economic. They created an enormous, guaranteed, year-round demand for fish that could not be substituted for by any other food. The Church's fasting requirements were, in their economic consequences, a massive market support mechanism for the fish trade, ensuring that the fishing and curing industries had a customer base that was not contingent on individual preference or purchasing power, but was mandated by religious obligation. Everyone had to eat fish on fast days, kings and peasants alike, bishops and ploughmen, monks and merchants, all of them were required by the same church law to abstain from meat and consume fish on the appointed days. In a world where Fridays and the Advent and Lenten seasons and the various other fast days might add up to something approaching 150 or even 200 days per year, the demand for preserved fish that this created was essentially the demand of an entire civilization, maintained by moral and spiritual authority, enforced by social pressure and ecclesiastical sanction. This is the world into which the autumn herring run arrived each year, and this is why it mattered so enormously. The herring did not merely provide food for a season, it provided the raw material for a food system that stretched across a continent and through an entire year. The autumn on the Scanian coast and at Great Yarmouth was not merely an autumn, it was the annual resetting of the supply, the moment when the stores that had been drawn down through the previous year were replenished. when the barrels were filled and the smokehouses ran day and night, and the smell of curing fish hung over entire coastal towns like a permanent weather system, the children of those towns grew up in that smell. They played in the rows between the smokehouses in Yarmouth. They helped carry salt and haul barrels and fetch wood. And the smell of autumn curing was as normal and as necessary a part of their world as the smell of the sea itself. They did not think it was remarkable. They did not think it was historical. They thought it was simply what autumn was, the time when the herring came, and the fires were lit, and the smoke rose, and the winter was made safe to face. They were right, in every practical sense. And they were also, though they could not have known it, participants in one of the great logistical achievements of the medieval world. The annual conversion of the sea's autumn abundance into the winter's survival, carried out in smoke and salt by the labor of communities all along the coasts of northern Europe, sending their preserved harvest inland and southward to feed a civilization through its long dark months. That is what the herring run was. That is what it meant. And that is why, every autumn, from the Scanian coast to the Norfolk shore, the fires were lit, the smoke rose, and the old work began again. Chapter 7. Every hand in the village. In autumn, the smoking of fish was not the work of one person, or even one family. It was not the work of a specialist called in for the purpose, not a task contracted out to someone with particular equipment or particular credentials. It was the work of everyone, every able body in the village, from the oldest man who could still lift a gutting knife to the youngest child who could carry a bucket of water or feed sticks to a fire. And this fact, this total communal mobilization around the autumn curing, is one of the most important things to understand about medieval village life, because it illuminates something that we have largely lost in our modern world of division of labor and individual economic agency. That survival, in the medieval village, was not and could not be an individual project. It was collective, always, structurally, necessarily, whether people liked one another or not. The village was not, let us be clear, a community of people who all got along. Medieval villagers gossiped and feuded and nursed grievances across generations with a tenacity that would exhaust a modern therapist. They disputed boundary stones and water rights and grazing privileges. They stole from each other's woodpiles and let their pigs wander into each other's gardens and argued about who owed whom what in the complex web of labor exchange and informal debt that knitted the village economy together. They had opinions about each other's character that they were not reluctant to express, and they lived in such close proximity, in such an almost total absence of privacy, since the single-room cottage offered no retreat from family members, let alone from neighbors, that the abrasions of communal life were constant and sometimes severe, and yet they worked together in autumn. They worked together because the alternative was not merely inconvenience or economic loss. The alternative was death, not dramatic, sudden death, but the slow, grinding, cold death of starvation in February, when the stored food ran out and the winter still had months to run and the river was locked in ice and the roads were impassable and there was nothing to do but wait and grow thinner and watch the children grow quieter. Against that alternative, the personal frictions of village life shrank to their proper size. The smoking of fish was too important, too urgent, and too large a task for any individual or family to accomplish alone. It required the whole village working in the coordination that necessity imposed in the autumn weeks before the cold came. Understanding how that coordination worked requires understanding how medieval villages were socially organized, which was, in most of northern Europe, in a system of obligations and customs that was more complex and more deeply embedded in daily life than any simple description can convey. The village was not, in most cases, a collection of independent households that happened to live near each other. It was an interlocking system of shared resources and mutual obligations. The common pasture, the common woodland, the common mill, the shared strips of the open field, managed by a mixture of formal custom, manorial regulation, and the informal authority of collective memory and communal expectation. Everyone owed something to everyone else, in forms that had been worked out over generations, and that were maintained, not by written contract, but by the social fabric of a community, in which everyone knew everyone, watched everyone, and remembered everything. The autumn fish curing operated within this system of mutual obligation, and it was organized with a degree of informal but effective efficiency that reflected its importance. In most villages, The work was divided not by conscious planning in any single sitting, not by a headman who called a meeting and assigned tasks, but by the customary allocation of roles that had developed over time and that everyone understood. Certain tasks went to men, certain tasks to women, certain tasks to children, certain tasks to whoever was strongest or most skilled or most available, and these allocations were maintained across years with the kind of conservative continuity that medieval village life in general exhibited toward anything that worked. The men, the adult men, the householders, and their grown sons and the cottagers' eldest boys took on the heaviest physical labor of the operation. This began at the river, where the fishing itself was the province of men, at least in terms of the boats and the deep water nets. Fishing in the medieval world was not casual. It was skilled, dangerous, physically demanding work that required both technical knowledge and considerable strength. The nets used for the autumn herring and the larger river fish were heavy things woven from twisted plant fibers or, in later medieval centuries, from imported hemp cordage, weighted at the bottom with stones, or lead and buoyed at the top with floats of sealed bladders, or cork or hollowed-out wood. Throwing such a net correctly, hauling it in against the current when it was full of fish, managing it in a moving boat without becoming entangled or capsizing. All of this required practice and strength and an intuitive understanding of the water that was built up over years of working on it. The boats themselves were simple craft, flat-bottomed punts on the shallower rivers, clinker-built rowing boats on the broader waters, small sailing vessels on the larger rivers and the estuarine reaches where sail was practical. They were maintained and repaired by the men who used them, understood intimately as the tools of a trade that a man's livelihood and the village's winter both depended on. A boat with a sprung plank or a torn net on the morning of a good fishing day was a crisis, and the ability to make a fast field repair, to caulk a leak with moss and rags, to splice a broken line, to mend a net with the quick knotting technique that every fisherman's fingers knew, was as essential as the ability to cast and haul in the first place. The catch was brought ashore, and the second phase of the heavy men's work began. Portage. Fish in autumn were caught in quantities that strained the carrying capacity of the village's carts and the backs of its people. The fish had to be moved from the water to the gutting area as quickly as possible, because speed mattered, because every hour of delay was spoilage advancing, and the baskets and barrows and carts that carried them were constantly moving between the riverbank and the processing area in a relay that continued as long as the fishing continued, which in the peak of autumn might be from before dawn to after dark. The gutting, which in large-scale professional operations was a specialized role, performed at extraordinary speed by dedicated workers, in the village context was done by a mixture of men and older children working under the direction of the more experienced. Gutting a fish is not technically difficult. It is a matter of 2 or 3 cuts with a sharp knife and a quick extraction of the entrails. But doing it quickly, cleanly, and consistently across hundreds or thousands of fish in the course of a day, without either dawdling or making the mistakes that damaged the flesh and reduced the quality of the cure, was a skill that required practice. The experienced gutters worked quickly, almost without looking, their hands moving in a rhythm that was its own kind of efficiency, while newer hands watched and learned and gradually increased their pace until they too could process a fish in the few seconds that the work demanded. The women held the knowledge of the salt, and this was not a peripheral or subordinate knowledge. It was the central expertise of the operation, the understanding on which everything else depended. And in many villages it was held primarily or exclusively by women, the fishwives and the farmwives and the goodwives of the cottages, whose cumulative experience of curing, passed from mother to daughter through uncounted autumns, constituted the most important single body of knowledge in the village's practical life. To be trusted with the salt in a medieval curing operation was to be trusted with the most expensive input in the process. The salt had been bought or traded for at cost. It was finite. It could not be replaced quickly if it ran out, and using it correctly, not wastefully, not insufficiently, but with the precise judgment that produced a properly cured fish, without wasting the precious minero, required the kind of calibrated instinct that only experience could give. The women who directed the salting were performing, without the language to describe it as such, a form of quality control. They were the ones who decided, batch by batch, fish by fish, whether more salt was needed or less, whether the cure was proceeding correctly, whether a particular batch smelled or felt wrong and needed different treatment. They also directed the preparation of the brine troughs, the great wooden vats in which the fish were layered with salt and left to begin their cure before smoking. These troughs had to be kept clean, a constant effort, since the pickle that formed in them was an ideal growth medium for the very bacteria the salt was supposed to inhibit. If the concentration fell too low, or the trough was not properly maintained, the women monitored the pickle, tasted it, knew from the salinity and the smell and the appearance whether it was doing its work. They knew the signs of a brine gone wrong, the particular sour smell, the slight cloudiness, the changed texture of the fish beginning to spoil despite the salt, and they knew what to do about it. When to salt more heavily, when to drain and refresh the brine, when to accept that a batch was compromised and divert it to immediate use rather than long-term storage. This expertise was also the expertise of timing. The women of the village knew how long each type of fish needed in the salt before it was ready for the smokehouse. Knew it not from a written schedule, but from a felt sense of the fish itself. From touching and examining and smelling the curing flesh at intervals to judge its progress. A herring needed different treatment from an eel. A salmon needed different treatment from a pike. Fat fish cured differently from lean fish. Thick pieces cured more slowly than thin ones. All of this variation had to be accounted for and managed continuously across the weeks of the autumn curing season, and the women who managed it were doing something that required genuine intellectual engagement as well as physical labor. The children were the village's most flexible labor resource in autumn, as they were in all the seasons of agricultural and domestic work. They did not have the strength for the heavy hauling or the skill for the gutting or the knowledge for the salting, but there were many things that needed doing that required only willing hands, steady attention, and the ability to follow instructions and sustain effort across a long working day. Qualities that children in the medieval village developed early, out of necessity. A child who was old enough to be useful was old enough to be working, and a child who was not yet old enough to be assigned specific tasks was old enough to be out of the way, watching and absorbing, learning the rhythms and the details of the work that would one day be theirs to do. The children's most important single contribution to the smoking operation was the tending of the fire. This sounds simple and is not. A smoking fire is a fire that must be maintained at a specific and narrow range of temperature and smoke output for hours, and in some cases days, at a time. It must be fed regularly, with the right wood, in the right quantities, at the right intervals. It must be banked and adjusted in response to changes in the ambient temperature and humidity. It must be watched for the telltale signs that it is burning too hot, a brightening of the flames, a thinning of the smoke, or too cool, a darkening and thickening of the smoke, the fire beginning to die. A child of 8 or 10, properly taught and given clear instructions, could manage a smoking fire through a working day under the supervision of an adult who checked in at intervals. And this freed the adults, the men and women with the higher order skills, to do the work that only they could do. The children also carried water from the river to keep the salt troughs clean and a brine at the right level. They carried wood from the woodpile to the smokehouse. They carried gutted fish from the brining troughs to the hanging hooks inside the smokehouse. They carried salt from the salt store. They carried messages between the different stations of the operation, between the fishermen at the river and the gutters at the processing tables, and the women at the salt troughs and the fire tenders in the smokehouse, providing the communication network through which the whole operation was coordinated without any central controller. They were, in this sense, the nervous system of the autumn curing, the channel through which information and materials flowed between the different parts of a distributed, multi-stage process that had to work in coordinated sequence if it was to work at all. The elderly bows, men and women who had passed beyond the age of heavy labor but who had not yet reached the incapacity of extreme old age, occupied a role in the autumn curing. That was perhaps the most important of all, though it was the least physically demanding and the least visible in any simple account of the work being done. They watched, they supervised, they corrected, they remembered. In a community without writing, the institutional memory of complex practical operations resided entirely in the living bodies and minds of its most experienced members. The old woman who had smoked fish for 50 autumns knew things that could not be learned in 5 or 10, knew them in a way that went beyond technical knowledge into something more like wisdom about the operation as a whole. The ability to see problems developing before they became crises, to recognize in the smell or the color or the texture of the cure that something was going wrong and to intervene before it was too late. This knowledge was irreplaceable in the most literal sense. If it was not transmitted before its holder died, it died with them. And so the elderly supervised, corrected, answered questions, explained their reasoning when they could find the words for it, and demonstrated with their own hands when words were insufficient. The transmission was not formal. It was not a class or a lecture. It happened in the midst of the work itself, in the natural back and forth between those who knew and those who were learning, in the correction of mistakes as they occurred, and the praise of good work when it was done, and the patient repetition of techniques until they became automatic. This is how human beings have always transmitted practical knowledge, from the first teaching of flint knapping to the last master craftsman showing an apprentice how to hold a tool. The medium was not language, but shared attention, looking at the same thing together, doing the same thing side by side, making the knowledge visible and tangible and inhabitable rather than merely describable. This is what the autumn curing taught. Beyond the specific techniques of gutting and salting and smoking, it taught the children of the village how to work together, how to sustain effort across a long and physically demanding collective project, how to take their assigned role in a larger system and execute it reliably without needing to understand every other role or have the whole picture explained to them. It taught them how to watch the experienced and learn from observation. It taught them patience, the particular patience of a process that cannot be hurried, that will take the time it takes regardless of how urgently the outcome is needed, and the complementary quality of sustained attention, the ability to keep monitoring a slow process across hours and days without losing focus. These are not small things. These are the foundations of any complex cooperative endeavor, and the medieval village taught them through the autumn curing as surely and as effectively as any formal education could have. The children who learned them became the adults who ran the operation in their turn, and they taught their own children in the same way, and the knowledge and the culture of collective work that it embodied persisted, autumn after autumn, generation after generation, sustained not by any institution or authority, but by the simple fact that it was necessary and it worked. There was a social dimension to this collective work that went beyond its practical function. The autumn curing was one of the great shared experiences of the village year, one of the moments when the whole community came together around a single purpose and worked, side by side, in a common space, toward an outcome that everyone needed. The long days at the processing tables were days of talk as well as work, of gossip and story and song and argument, of the kind of conversation that flows easily between people doing physical labor together, when the hands are occupied and the mind is free and the company is familiar. In a world almost entirely without entertainment in any organized sense, the communal work of autumn was also, in its way, a social occasion, one of the times when the village came alive as a community rather than merely as a collection of separate households. The bonds made in that shared labor were real bonds, the kind that are made through shared difficulty and shared purpose rather than through choice. You might not like the man working next to you at the gutting table, but you respected his skill. You depended on his effort. You knew him in the specific and intimate way that comes from working alongside someone through long, hard days toward a common goal. The village was held together not only by proximity and economic necessity, but by these experiences of mutual effort, renewed each season, remembered across years, forming the connective tissue of a community that had to function as a unit if it was to function at all. It held together because it had to, and in holding together to smoke the fish, it did something more than merely ensure its own winter survival. It reproduced itself as a community, renewed its sense of collective identity and collective capability, demonstrated to itself and to its children that it was competent, that it knew what it was doing, that it had the knowledge and the will and the organization to take care of itself. This is not a small thing. This is, in fact, one of the most fundamental things that a human community can do, show itself, through effective collective action, that it is capable of its own survival. The autumn curing was many things: economic necessity, technical process, religious obligation, trade foundation. But it was also, at its deepest level, an act of community self-formation. We know how to do this. We do it together. We will be all right. Every autumn, every hand, the whole village. Because that was what it took, and what it took was what they gave. Chapter 8. The Wisdom of Smoke. Medieval people did not know the word phenol. They had never heard of guaiacol or syringal or furfural or any of the other compounds that modern or said analytical chemistry can detect in wood smoke with its gas chromatographs and mass spectrometers. They had no conception of bacteria as distinct living organisms. The germ theory of disease was still more than 500 years in the future. and the idea that microscopic creatures, invisible to the human eye, were the agents of putrefaction and illness would have seemed, to a medieval peasant, either obvious nonsense or dangerous magic, depending on the context in which it was proposed. They had no laboratory, no instruments of measurement beyond the simplest scales and measures, no written records of experiments, no tradition of systematic inquiry into the mechanisms of the natural world, of the kind that would eventually develop into modern science. And yet they smoked fish with a precision and an effectiveness that, judged by its outcomes, by the quality of the preserved product, by the length of time it kept, by the reliability with which the process produced consistent results across seasons and across generations, compares favorably with a great deal of deliberate scientific food technology. They did not know why it worked, but they knew, with extraordinary thoroughness and accumulated depth, exactly how to make it work. And the gap between knowing why and knowing how, between the theory and the practice is, in the domain of practical skill, very much smaller than it might appear from the outside. What smoke actually does to fish flesh, in the terms that modern food science would use to describe it, is this. It applies to the surface and the outer layers of the flesh, a complex mixture of chemical compounds that are produced by the incomplete combustion of wood. When wood burns, particularly when it burns at the lower temperatures and with the restricted oxygen supply characteristic of a smoldering smoking fire, it does not simply convert its organic material to carbon dioxide and water, as it would in a perfectly efficient combustion. Instead, the complex organic molecules that make up wood, the cellulose, the hemicellulose, the lignin, are broken apart into smaller fragments that are volatile enough to become airborne, but complex enough to retain a rich chemistry. These fragments rise in the smoke, and when they contact the cooler surface of the hanging fish, they condense on it, depositing a thin but chemically active layer of preserved compounds. Among these compounds, the phenols are the most important for preservation. Phenol itself and its many structural relatives, guaiacol, casol, catechol, vanillin among them, are powerfully antimicrobial. They disrupt the cellular membranes of bacteria, interfering with their metabolic processes and ultimately killing them or preventing their reproduction. The surface of a fish that has been properly smoked for a sufficient period is coated in these phenolic compounds to a depth that bacteria cannot easily penetrate, creating what amounts to a chemical barrier against the organisms of decay. The aldehydes in wood smoke serve a complementary function. They react with the proteins on the surface of the fish flesh, cross-linking the protein molecules in a process that effectively denatures and stabilizes the outer layer. This cross-linking has two effects. It further reduces the susceptibility of the outer flesh to bacterial attack, since denatured proteins are less nutritionally available to bacteria, and it helps to create the distinctive firm, slightly glossy surface of properly smoked fish, the skin that is slightly dry to the touch and that acts as a physical as well as a chemical barrier to contamination. The organic acids in wood smoke, formic acid, acetic acid, and others, contribute to preservation by lowering the surface pH of the fish flesh, creating an acidic environment that is additionally hostile to bacterial growth. And the heat of the smokehouse, even in cold smoking where the temperatures are deliberately kept below the point at which the fish would actually cook, contributes the drying effect that reduces the water activity of the flesh, the availability of water to support bacterial metabolism in ways that supplement and extend everything that the salt has already done. All of this is happening simultaneously, interactively, in a process of considerable biochemical complexity. And medieval people knew none of it. What they knew was the outcome of it. They knew what properly smoked fish looked like, felt like, smelled like, tasted like. They knew how long it lasted. They knew what went wrong when the smoking was done incorrectly. And they knew what wrong smoked fish looked, felt, smelled, and tasted like too. They held this knowledge not as a set of propositions to be stated, but as a set of discriminations to be made. The practical ability to look at a batch of fish in various stages of the smoking process and judge, correctly and reliably, whether it was developing as it should or whether intervention was needed. This kind of knowledge, what the philosopher Michael Polanyi famously called tacit knowledge, knowledge that cannot be fully articulated in explicit statements, but that resides in the practitioner's ability to perform, is not inferior to propositional or scientific knowledge. It is different from it. In some respects, it is superior to it, because it is robust to the failure of understanding in ways that explicit knowledge is not. If you know that phenols are antimicrobial, and you know this as a fact in your head, but you have never smoked a fish in your life, you cannot use that knowledge to produce a properly smoked fish. Whereas, if you have smoked fish for 30 years, and you have never heard the word phenol, you can produce a properly smoked fish with remarkable reliability. The knowledge is in the practice, and the practice carries the knowledge forward intact, even when the theory behind it is entirely unknown. Medieval fishwives and smokehouse managers knew things about the smoking process that a modern chemist who had never done the work might struggle to reconstruct from first principles. They knew, for instance, that the height at which fish were hung in the smokehouse mattered. Fish hung close to the fire, in the hottest and most smoke-dense zone of the house, cured fastest but kept least well. The aggressive initial treatment produced a surface layer that was well smoked, but the interior of the flesh was less thoroughly penetrated by the smoke's protective compounds. Fish hung higher, in the cooler upper reaches of the smokehouse, where the temperature was lower, and the smoke had already deposited much of its heavier compounds on the surfaces below. Cured more slowly, but kept longer, the gentler, more prolonged treatment allowed the smoke to penetrate more deeply into the flesh, building up a more thorough and durable protection. This understanding of the gradient within the smokehouse, the three-dimensional map of temperature and smoke density and their effects on the curing fish, was not theoretical. It was experiential, built up through observation of what happened to fish hung at different heights over many seasons of curing. It was probably never articulated as a principle, even within the community that held it. It was simply known in the sense that an experienced practitioner would, without being asked to think about it, automatically put the fish intended for long storage higher and the fish intended for nearer-term consumption lower, just as they might automatically reach for the salt with their right hand or gut the fish from tail to head, rather than the reverse. The knowledge was embedded in the habit, and the habit was correct. They knew, similarly, that the timing of the smoking mattered, that fish put into the smokehouse immediately after the salt cure, while still wet and surface cool from the brine, absorbed smoke differently than fish that had been allowed to dry in the air for a period first. The initial drying, hanging the brined fish in a cool, airy place for a few hours to allow the surface to form the pellicle. A thin, slightly sticky protein layer that formed as the surface dried was a step that experienced smokers included as a matter of course, because experience had shown that fish with a good pellicle took the smoke more evenly and developed a better surface than fish that went straight from the brine into the smoke. The pellicle was not understood as pellicle. That word and the biochemical understanding behind it came much later, but its formation was known and encouraged nonetheless. They knew about wood. The knowledge of which wood to use and which to avoid was perhaps the most universally shared element of smoking expertise, and it extended well beyond the simple rule of hardwood good, softwood bad. Among the hardwoods, there were understood differences. Oak was prized for the depth and richness it gave. The dense, complex smoke of oak produced a deep color and a flavor of remarkable quality in the cured fish, and the slow, sustained burn of seasoned oak was ideal for the long, low heat of a cold smoking operation. Beech was similarly valued. It smoked clean and slightly sweet, producing a lighter color than oak, but excellent flavor and preservation. Alder was the traditional smokehouse wood in many coastal communities, particularly along the rivers where it grew abundantly, and its smoke had a moist, slightly herby character that suited fish particularly well, so much so that alder has remained the preferred smokewood for salmon in the Scottish tradition right to the present day. Fruitwoods, apple, cherry pear, were used when available and were prized for the sweetness they contributed to the smoke's flavor profile. They burned hot and fast relative to the denser hardwoods, which meant they were often used in combination with slower burning wood rather than alone, adding their aromatic contribution without dominating the fire. Elm burned slowly and with a heavy smoke that was considered acceptable in some traditions and too bitter in others. Walnut produced a strong, distinctive smoke that was valued for certain products and considered too overpowering for others. This was a genuinely sophisticated body of wood knowledge, comparable in its detail and its context dependence to the knowledge of a modern competition barbecue team, deciding which wood to use for which protein, and it had been developed by the same method, sustained empirical experimentation, conducted over many seasons, with consequences serious enough to make memory sharp. They knew about whether this is perhaps the least obvious aspect of the expertise, and the one most likely to be overlooked by anyone thinking about smoking as a purely technical process conducted in an enclosed space. But the smokehouse was not hermetically sealed from the outside world. It was a rough structure of wood and thatch, its fire drawing on outside air through its earth pit. its smoke escaping through the gaps in the roof and walls rather than through any controlled vent. What happened inside the smokehouse was substantially affected by what was happening outside it. The ambient temperature, the humidity, the wind direction and strength, the presence or absence of rain. On a cold, dry, clear day with a light wind, the smoking fire drew well. The smoke was dense and even. The temperature inside the house stayed in the right range, and the curing proceeded at its proper pace. On a damp, still, overcast day, the fire drew poorly. The smoke was too heavy and wet. The temperature dropped, and the fish were at risk of developing mold on their surface before the smoke's antimicrobial compounds had built up to protective levels. On a very windy day, the fire drew too well, burning too hot and too fast, thinning the smoke and raising the temperature toward cooking rather than curing. The experienced smokehouse manager read the weather every morning before deciding how to set up the fire for the day, and made adjustments throughout the day as conditions changed. This weather reading was not a separate skill from the smoking skill. It was integrated with it, part of the same body of contextual knowledge that told the experienced practitioner how to produce the right outcome from the variable inputs that the real world provided. It is the mark of genuine mastery in any craft, the ability to produce consistent outcomes from inconsistent conditions, to compensate for variability in the raw materials and the environment by adjusting the process in ways that only deep experience can suggest. And the fish themselves were variable. Different catches from the same river, taken in different conditions, at different points in the autumn, might vary considerably in their fat content, their surface condition, their initial state of freshness. Fat fish absorbed smoke differently from lean fish. Fish taken in cold water cured at a different rate from fish taken in warmer water earlier in the season. Fish that had been thoroughly bled after catching cured differently from fish that had not. The experienced curer knew these things not as abstract facts but as felt qualities of the fish in their hands. The slightly soft give of a very fat fish, the firmer resistance of a lean one, the difference in smell between fish taken yesterday and fish taken this morning, and adjusted their process accordingly. What all of this adds up to is not a primitive approximation of food science. It is a sophisticated, effective, deeply contextual body of practical knowledge that achieved through the mechanism of accumulated experience rather than experimental method, outcomes that modern food science would entirely approve of. The phenols, the aldehydes, the acids, the drying, the denaturation, all of it was happening, correctly, in the right sequence, at the right intensities, in the medieval smokehouse run by an experienced curer who had never heard any of these words. The theory was absent. The practice was complete, and this should prompt us to think carefully about what we mean when we say that a civilization had or did not have knowledge of something. The medieval world did not have the theoretical knowledge of smoke chemistry that our world has. But it had the practical knowledge of smoke chemistry, the knowledge that is demonstrated not in words but in outcomes, in the quality of the product, in the length of time it kept, in the reliability with which the process could be reproduced across seasons and generations. Whether we call this knowledge or something else, craft, wisdom, skill, tradition, it worked, and things that work reliably and effectively across centuries, that are trusted with the survival of communities because they have earned that trust through consistent performance. These things deserve our respect and our careful attention. This is what it means to know something truly, in the deepest sense. Not to understand the theory, but to hold the practice in your hands. Not to be able to explain what the smoke does to the fish, but to be able to make the smoke do it correctly, every time. In a leaking wooden building in the grey October cold, with a fire of alder wood, and a catch of herring and the winter coming on. Chapter 9. What they stored, and why. A medieval village's winter larder was a calculation, not a calculation performed on paper, with columns of figures and neat arithmetic. Paper was scarce, and literacy was rarer still in the rural communities of medieval Europe, and a peasant who could read and write was unusual enough to occasion comment. It was a calculation performed in the mind, in the memory, in the experienced judgment of the household head, and perhaps more importantly, in the accumulated domestic intelligence of the housewife who managed the daily drawdown of stored supplies through the long winter months, and who knew, from long practice, exactly how fast different foods depleted, and exactly how much of each was needed to reach the other side of winter without catastrophe. The calculation was this: how many people needed to be fed, for how many days, from what combination of stored foods. across a winter that began in earnest around the 1st of November and did not reliably release its grip until March or even April in a hard year, and not just fed in the vague sense of receiving calories sufficient to prevent starvation. Though preventing starvation was the irreducible minimum requirement, the floor below which the calculation must not drop, but fed in a way that satisfied the complex social, religious, and nutritional requirements of medieval domestic life. This was harder than it sounds, because those requirements were numerous and specific and non-negotiable in ways that severely constrained the options available to the person doing the planning. Begin with the most basic requirement: calories. A medieval peasant doing heavy agricultural or craft labor, and the work of winter, though lighter than the peak summer work, was still substantial: hauling wood, tending animals, maintaining equipment, processing stored grain at the mill, carrying water through snow, mending and building in the cold, needed somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 calories per day to maintain body weight and work capacity. Children needed proportionally less, elderly people more or less, depending on their health and activity level. A household of 6, including 2 working adults, 2 older children doing significant work, and 2 younger children, might need somewhere in the range of 12,000 to 15,000 calories per day to maintain itself through the winter, more in the coldest months when the body burned more energy simply staying warm, less in the milder periods at the margins of the season. Across the approximately 150 days of serious winter, from November through March, such a household needed somewhere between 1.8 and 2.25 million calories in stored food. This is an enormous quantity, and it had to come from foods that could be stored successfully for that duration, which eliminated the majority of what the medieval diet contained in the summer months. No fresh vegetables beyond the hardiest root crops that could be buried in sand or straw. No fresh fruit beyond what could be dried or fermented. No fresh milk after the cows dried up in late autumn. No fresh meat beyond what was slaughtered and eaten quickly in the early winter, or preserved in salt. And no fresh fish beyond what could be taken from the frozen river through the ice on the occasional open day. A supplement, in a good winter, but never a reliable supply. What could be stored? The categories were relatively few and relatively well understood: grain, dried legumes, root vegetables, hard cheese, cured and smoked meat, preserved fruit, and fish dried, salted, smoked, or some combination of all 3. Each of these categories had its own preservation logic, its own storage requirements, its own rate of depletion, and its own place in the weekly rhythm of the household diet. And each had its own vulnerabilities. Grain could be ruined by damp or infested by vermin. Root vegetables rotted if they were not kept at exactly the right temperature and humidity. Dried legumes lost nutritional value over time and became harder to cook. Cheese mold in conditions that were too warm and dry in conditions that were too cold. Cured meat might develop rancidity if the fat in it oxidized, particularly in the slightly warmer early winter before the serious cold came. The management of this larder, the monitoring, the adjusting, the deciding what to eat today in order to preserve enough of the most vulnerable items while stretching out the more stable ones, was a continuous, skilled, daily exercise that fell primarily to the woman of the household, the housewife in the original and literal sense of the word, the wife of the house, the manager of its domestic economy. The housewife knew the larder the way a merchant knew his inventory. She knew what was in it, where it was, how much of it there was, and roughly how long it would last at the current rate of consumption. She adjusted the daily meals to keep all the stored categories in proportion, eating the most perishable things first, rationing the most stable, using her judgment about the likely length of the winter to calibrate how quickly they could afford to eat through the stocks. Fish occupied a specific and critical place in this calculation, and it is worth spelling out exactly what that place was and why it could not be filled by any other stored food. The position of fish in the medieval winter larder was not merely that of a protein source, though it was certainly that, and an important one. It was shaped, in ways that went beyond simple nutrition, by the religious calendar that governed every aspect of medieval life. The medieval church's fasting requirements were not a marginal or occasional imposition. They were structural, built into the weekly and annual cycle of time in a way that fundamentally shaped what people ate and when. The basic requirement was abstinence from meat on Fridays, the day of Christ's crucifixion, observed every week throughout the year. In addition, the entire season of Lent, The 40-day period of penitential preparation before Easter required abstinence from meat and, in many stricter interpretations, from eggs and dairy products as well, leaving fish as virtually the only animal food permitted. The season of Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was also a fasting period in many parts of the medieval church, with similar requirements. And beyond these regular seasons, there were the vigils of major saints' days, the evenings before the great feasts of the church calendar, which required fasting from meat, as well as the ember days, the additional quarterly fasting periods that the church prescribed. When you add up all of these required fish days and count them across the year, the numbers are striking. 52 Fridays, the 40 days of Lent, plus the vigils that preceded it, the days of Advent, the various vigils and ember days, and local saints' observances, in a devout medieval household, and nearly all households were devout in a way that went beyond mere social convention, because the church was not a voluntary association or a leisure activity, but the total framework within which medieval life was understood, conducted, and given meaning. The number of days in the year on which meat could not be eaten, and on which fish was the appropriate food if any animal protein was to be had at all, ran to somewhere between 150 and 200. Consider what this meant for the winter larder calculation. In a winter of 150 days, something approaching half of those days, perhaps 60 or 70 of them, were days on which the household was required to eat fish rather than meat, and the stock of fish in the larder had to be calculated to cover those days specifically, regardless of what else was available. You could not substitute salted pork on a Friday in Lent because you had run short of fish. You could not make up the deficit with beans and cheese on the vigil of a saint's day and explain to God that you had intended to eat fish but had miscalculated. The requirement was specific, the obligation moral as well as social, and the failure to meet it carried real consequences, not just the social embarrassment of being seen to have failed in one's religious obligations, but the spiritual weight of sin, the damage to one's relationship with God and with the community of the faithful. This meant that the autumn fish cure had to be planned, not just to provide protein for the winter, but to provide fish specifically. Fish in the right quantities to cover the specific days on which fish was required, with some margin for the unexpected. A household that entered winter with 200 smoked herring had to know that 60 of those herring were, in effect, already spoken for, reserved against the fasting days of the winter, unavailable for general use, however hungry the family might be, in a hard week in January. The remaining 140 were available for ordinary use, to fill out meals on the non-fasting days when the diet would be supplemented with whatever meat remained in the salt barrel, and with the stored grain and legumes and roots that formed the carbohydrate and vegetable foundations of the winter diet. This double calculation, planning for both total caloric sufficiency and specific dietary requirement against the fasting calendar, was a genuine intellectual challenge, and the people who performed it, year after year, got better at it over time, building up the kind of calibrated experience that allowed them to know, almost instinctively, whether the autumn's catch was going to be adequate to see the household through, or whether adjustments needed to be made. Those adjustments might mean buying or trading for additional fish at the autumn markets, or making deals with other households to share surplus and deficit, or finding ways to supplement the fish supply through the winter, ice fishing on the frozen river, or purchasing additional smoked fish from the merchants who moved through the area in the weeks when the stock began to run uncomfortably low. The social dimension of this calculation was also important. Medieval households did not plan entirely in isolation from one another. The village as a whole had an interest in whether any of its constituent households was likely to fall short of food before spring, because a household that ran out of food was a household that would come to its neighbors for help. And a village that could not help all its members through a hard winter was a village that was in trouble. There was therefore a degree of collective visibility into individual households' storage situations, not the intrusive accounting of a modern bureaucracy, but the naturally calibrated awareness of a community in which everyone knew roughly how many mouths their neighbors were feeding and roughly what kind of autumn they had had. The stored fish was visible in the most literal sense in many households, hanging from the rafters of the cottage in the traditional way, where everyone who entered the single room could see it and count it. This visibility was not merely convenience. It was a form of social transparency that allowed the community to monitor its own overall food security situation and to identify, early in the winter, any households that might need support before crisis rather than after. The village that knew in November that old Agnes and her grandchildren had smoked fewer fish than usual and had a smaller grain store than normal could begin quietly directing surplus toward them, a few extra herring from a household that had caught well, a loan of grain to be repaid at harvest, before the family was actually hungry, which was both more effective and more dignified than waiting for hunger to make the problem visible. The fish, then, was not just food. It was the most legible element of a household's winter preparation, the most easily assessed marker of whether a family was going to be all right or was going to struggle. The size of the smoking operation in autumn, how many fish a household put up, how long the fire ran, how full the hanging racks were, was the community's most direct measure of its own collective security, and everyone paid attention to it with the focused interest of people whose own well-being was not entirely separable from that of their neighbors. This is the context in which the autumn curing must be understood, not just as individual family provision, and not just as communal ritual, but as a system of distributed food security planning operated at the village scale, visible and legible to everyone in it, in which the individual household calculation and the community-level calculation were part of the same connected process. The smoke rising from every cottage's rafters, the fish hanging visible through every open door, was the village reading its own balance sheet, assessing its own situation, taking stock in the most literal sense, before the gates of winter closed. Chapter 10. Through the darkest months. Imagine now that the smoking is done. Imagine that the autumn, that urgent, golden, smoky, exhausting autumn, full of nets and salt and fire and the smell of curing flesh, has finally given way to the thing it was always preparing for. Imagine that November has arrived, sullen and grey and permanent seeming, bringing with it the first hard frosts and the first weeks of rain, so steady and cold that it soaks through the thatch of the cottage in the night and drips onto the sleeping family and is simply wiped away in the morning without complaint, because complaint would not stop the rain. The fish are in the storehouse now, or hanging from the cottage rafters, or packed in barrels in the coolest corner of the outbuilding, where the pig used to be before it was slaughtered, at Martinmas and salted down in the great crocks that stand against the north wall. The grain is in the granary, locked against the rats and the damp with whatever ingenuity the village carpenter could bring to bear. The root vegetables are buried in their sand, the dried beans rattling in their sacks, the hard round cheeses wrapped in cloth and stored on the high shelf. The preparation is over, the winter has begun, and there is nothing to do now but wait and endure and eat as carefully and as well as the stored supplies will allow. The pace of life changes in winter in the medieval village in a way that is almost impossible for a modern person to fully appreciate, because we have no experience of a world in which darkness and cold genuinely limit what can be done. We turn on lights, we turn on heat, we drive through the dark to places that are lit and warm and full of activity. We do not stop in winter, not really, not in the deep, structural way that medieval winter stopped things. Medieval winter stopped things, not completely. There was always work to do, always animals to be fed, and fires to be kept, and repairs to be made, and grain to be processed at the mill on the days when the mill could operate. But the pace slowed enormously, and with it the caloric demand of the household. A man who in summer worked from before dawn to after dark in the fields, burning through 4,000 calories in a long harvesting day, was in January working perhaps half as many hours and burning perhaps 3,000 or less on the days when the cold or the snow made outdoor work genuinely impossible, and the family sat close to the fire and did the indoor tasks, mending and spinning and carving and weaving, that the cold months provided time for. This was important for the larder calculation. The slower pace of winter meant that less food was needed than the raw numbers of mouths to feed would suggest, because the mouths were working less hard and therefore consuming fewer calories per day. The medieval peasant body was also considerably better adapted to this kind of seasonal variation in food intake than the modern body, accustomed from childhood to the annual cycle of relative plenty in summer and relative scarcity in winter, carrying the metabolic flexibility of a body that had always been managed this way, and that could, within limits, reduce its energy demands in response to reduced supply without the kind of acute distress that a modern well-fed person would experience from the same reduction. But the limits were real, and they could be crossed. The danger zone in medieval winter provisioning was not November or December, when the stored food was still plentiful and the memory of autumn's abundance was fresh. It was the weeks from late January through March, the period that medieval people sometimes called the Hungry Gap, or used their own regional equivalent, when the winter had been going on long enough that the stored supplies were running low and the new growth of spring was still weeks away. This was the period when the careful calculation of autumn had to pay off, when the household that had stored wisely and eaten carefully through the earlier winter weeks arrived at the hungry gap with enough left in the larder to bridge the gap to spring, and the household that had not arrived at it already short. The fish were critical to surviving the hungry gap, specifically because they were the stored food that lasted longest and that degraded most slowly. Properly smoked and salted herring, kept in a cool, dry place, was still safe to eat in March, still providing protein and fat and the dense, concentrated nutrition of preserved fish, when many of the other stored foods were either gone or had been reduced to their least desirable forms. The root vegetables that remained in March were the ones that had been missed in the sorting, the ones with soft spots developing, the ones beginning to sprout, the ones that needed to be trimmed and checked before eating. The dried beans were still sound, but had been cooked and eaten so many times in so many similar pots of broth that the household had long since lost the energy to feel grateful for them. The grain was getting low. The cheese was gone, or nearly so. The salt pork, if there had been any, was long finished. But the smoked fish remained, stiff and dark and smelling of old autumn, hanging from the rafter or packed in their barrel. They were still food, still the protein component of a meal, still capable of feeding the family through the last hard weeks of the cold season. And when a fasting day came in February or March, a Friday in Lent, a Wednesday in the church's additional abstinence prescription, the family did not have to make apologies to God or to their own conscience, because there was still fish. There was still fish because the autumn had been managed correctly, because the fire had burned long enough and the salt had been sufficient and the hanging time had been right. And now the reward for all of that careful, exhausting, collective effort was this: food in February. Fish on a Friday in Lent. The gap bridged. The winter survived. The meal that came from a winter fish was not a luxurious one, even by medieval standards. A smoked herring, properly preserved, was a dense and intensely flavored thing, its flesh compressed by the combination of salt and drying and smoke into something far more concentrated than the fresh fish it had begun as. A single herring was a significant meal component in a way that a single fresh herring was not, because it had lost perhaps a third of its original weight to the curing process, and the flavor and nutrition that had been in that lost moisture were now concentrated in the remainder. But it needed preparation before it could be eaten. The long-cured fish, especially the heavily smoked red herring intended for very long storage, was often too salty and too dry to eat as it came from the rack. It needed to be soaked in water, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight, to soften and rehydrate the flesh and to draw out enough of the salt to make it palatable. The soaking water was changed several times, and it took on the salt and some of the strong smoky flavor of the fish, leaving the flesh milder and somewhat more like the fresh fish it had once been, though darker and firmer and more concentrated still. After soaking, the fish was cooked, usually in a pot of water with whatever vegetables the household had available, the broth taking on the flavor of the fish and the fish, softening in the heat until it flaked apart in chunks that were distributed through the broth with whatever root vegetables had been available, a few dried peas, perhaps a handful of grain to thicken the pot. It was what it was, a winter dish, made from stored food by people who were tired of winter and tired of the limited flavors available to them, and who ate it nonetheless with genuine appetite, because they were genuinely hungry, and because appetite, in the medieval world, required no enhancement beyond honest labor and the passage of several hours since the last meal. But here is the thing about winter food, that our comfortable modern relationship with abundant, varied, always available food makes it difficult for us to properly appreciate. In the medieval winter, a meal that was adequate was a meal that was good. Not good in the sense of refined or pleasurable or aesthetically satisfying, though those qualities were not absent from the medieval experience of food any more than they are from any human experience of eating. Good in the prior sense, sufficient, fulfilling the body's need, quieting the hollow urgency of real hunger, allowing the family around the fire to feel, for the hours between this meal and the next, that they were going to be all right. The smoked fish gave them this. It gave them protein in the weeks when protein was hardest to come by. It gave them the salt that their bodies needed, and that was, for a community doing physical work in the cold, not a health liability but a genuine physiological requirement. It gave them calories in a concentrated, shelf-stable form that the winter demanded. and it gave them, perhaps least obviously but perhaps most importantly, the sense of having been cared for by their own past selves, by the autumn community that had worked so hard and so skillfully to produce this resource. The smoked fish hanging in the February kitchen was proof that the autumn effort had been worth it, that the planning had worked, that the village knew how to take care of itself. That is not nothing. In a world of real scarcity and real uncertainty, the emotional experience of adequacy, of having enough, of having planned well, of arriving at the darkest part of the year with still something in the larder, was a form of contentment that we can only approximate from the outside. We can understand it intellectually, we can recognize its logic, but to feel it, to feel the particular relief and warmth of February adequacy after November anxiety, required the whole context of medieval winter, the genuine possibility of failure that made success mean something. The darkness of the medieval winter was also literal, and this too shaped the experience of the stored food in ways that are difficult to fully convey. The days in January in Northern Europe are extraordinarily short in Scotland. The sun rises around 9 and sets around 4, leaving 15 hours of darkness and grey twilight. In a cottage with no windows worthy of the name, no candles beyond a few tallow stubs reserved for genuine necessity, and only the fire for light and warmth. Those 15 hours of darkness were spent in close proximity to each other, telling stories and mending things, and sleeping far more than modern people do, and waiting for the light to return. In this context, the meal of smoked fish and winter broth was not just food, it was an event, the organizing moment of the day, the thing that broke the long hours into manageable segments, the occasion for gathering and warmth, and the particular sociability of eating together in the firelight. Medieval people ate together in ways that we have largely abandoned, not as a lifestyle choice or a deliberate family practice, but because there was one fire, one pot, one table if they had a table, and everyone in the household shared all of these. The meal was the hearth, and the hearth was the center of everything, and the smoked fish in the pot was the reason the hearth was a source of warmth tonight, rather than merely of light. This is what the autumn curing produced. Ultimately, not just calories, and not just protein, and not just the fulfillment of religious obligation. It produced the conditions for ordinary human life to continue in the darkest part of the year. It made possible the fireside meal, the shared bowl, the brief contentment of an adequate winter evening. It bought time, the time between now and spring, measured out in smoked fish taken one by one from the hanging rack, and it bought the ability to experience that time, not as a crisis endured, but as a winter lived, fully and humanly, by people who had prepared as well as they could, and were now reaping what they had sown in smoke and salt and autumn effort. Chapter 11. The smell that meant safety. There is a phenomenon that anyone who has thought carefully about human memory will recognize, even if they have never encountered the science behind it. It is the experience of smelling something, some particular and specific combination of notes, some conjunction of organic compounds that the olfactory system translates into a unified perception, and being transported, instantaneously and without conscious intention, back to a specific place and time and emotional state, not transported in the vague metaphorical sense that music or a photograph might evoke a memory, transported in the most literal experiential sense, the past suddenly present, vivid and physical, not recollected, but felt again. This phenomenon is sometimes called the Proustian memory, after the French novelist Marcel Proust, who described it with extraordinary precision in the opening pages of his long novel, the smell of a Madeleine cake dipped in tea suddenly restoring, complete and overwhelming, the entire lost world of his childhood summers. But the phenomenon predates Proust by thousands of years and will outlast him by thousands more, because it is not a literary device, but a neurological fact. The olfactory sense, the sense of smell, is neurologically unique among the human senses in the directness of its connection to the limbic system, the part of the brain most deeply associated with emotion and memory. When you smell something, the information travels a much shorter and more direct neural path to the emotional and memory centers of the brain than when you see or hear or touch something. The result is that smells access memories and emotions with a speed and a vividness that other senses cannot match, and that the memories they access are not merely recalled but re-experienced, not thought about but felt. For medieval children, growing up in villages where the autumn curing was the most significant communal activity of the year, where the smell of fish smoke was the smell of the entire community mobilizing around its own survival, the olfactory imprint of the autumn was laid down in early childhood with an intensity that nothing else in their experience could rival. The smell of hardwood smoke and curing fish and brine, and the particular damp autumn air that carried all of these together, was not merely a smell they remembered. It was a smell that, for the rest of their lives, would carry with it the full emotional weight of what it had meant when they first breathed it as children. Safety, preparation, adults doing what adults are supposed to do. The collective competence of the community that contains and protects you. This is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something important about the relationship between smell and culture that we tend to overlook in our modern, deodorized and scent-managed world. We live in an era that is deeply ambivalent about strong natural smells, an era that spends enormous resources and ingenuity on neutralizing, masking, or replacing the odors that organic life naturally produces. And that tends to treat any powerful smell of biological origin with a degree of suspicion or distaste. The smell of fish, in particular, has become in modern usage almost a universal signal of something gone wrong, something that needs to be disposed of, covered up, washed away. "It smells fishy" is a phrase that means something is not right, but this is a very modern association, and it reflects a very particular relationship to fish, one in which fish is something we encounter already, processed and packaged and odor managed, in which the smell of fish at its most natural and powerful is the smell of fish that is past its best, because we never encounter fish at its best in its natural olfactory state. In the medieval village, the smell of fish was everywhere and always, not because anything was wrong, but because fish was the central preserved food of the community, because it was curing and stored and being cooked at various stages all through the autumn and winter. And the smell of it was not a signal of decay or failure, but a signal of abundance, of preparation, of food successfully preserved against future need. The children of the village lived inside this smell for months of every year. They grew up in it the way they grew up in the smell of wood smoke and animal and earth, as an ambient condition of their world, as natural and unremarkable as the weather. And within this ambient condition, the specific smell of the autumn curing, the particular conjunction of hardwood smoke and brine and fresh fish and the cold October air, was associated, in their developing nervous systems, with something very specific. The moment when the village shifted from the anxious vulnerability of autumn into the managed security of winter preparation. When the nets came in heavy and the fires were lit and the whole community moved together toward the great task of making the winter survivable. This association, smell and emotional meaning, bound together in the deep memory of early experience, is one of the mechanisms by which culture reproduces itself across generations. The cultural practices of the autumn curing were transmitted through explicit teaching and through observation and through practice, but they were also transmitted through the emotional residue of childhood experience, through the felt meaning of the autumn smell that every child in the village would carry inside them for the rest of their life. When those children grew up and became the adults responsible for the autumn curing, they did not think of it as an interesting practice inherited from the past and worth preserving. They thought of it as simply what one did in autumn, as natural and inevitable as the turning of the leaves, as deeply connected to their sense of who they were and how the world worked as anything in their experience. The smell was a kind of anchor. When you smelled that particular combination, when the first morning of the curing season arrived, and the fires were lit, and the smoke began to rise from the old black building at the edge of the trees, something in you that was deeper than thought recognized it and responded to it, responded with the emotional resonance of all the autumns you had ever lived through that smell, all the way back to the very first autumn of conscious experience, when you were small enough to be carried on someone's back, and the smell surrounded you and the adults around you were busy and purposeful and knew what they were doing. This is also why, when things went wrong in the autumn curing, when the catch was poor, or the salt ran short, or the weather was bad for smoking, or some disaster interrupted the operation, the emotional impact was not merely the practical impact of reduced winter food stores, though that was real enough. It was also the disruption of something that felt, at a very deep level, like the right order of things. The smell that meant safety was not rising from the smokehouse. The adults were not doing the thing that adults were supposed to do in autumn. The world was not proceeding as it should. This was frightening in a way that went beyond the rational calculation of what the reduced fish stock would mean for February provisioning. It was frightening in the way that a threat to a fundamental and unreflective assumption about how the world works is always frightening, because it exposed the contingency of things that the comfort of habit had allowed to feel permanent and reliable. The flip side of this, of course, was the corresponding emotional experience when the curing went well, When the catch was abundant, and the salt was sufficient, and the weather cooperated, and the fires burned right, and the fish hung full and dark in the smokehouse at the end of a good autumn week. There was a satisfaction in this that was also deeper than rational calculation. Not just the knowledge that the winter was better provided for, the felt rightness of having done the thing correctly, in the right season, in the right way, with the community around you doing the same. The smell of a good cure was the smell of competence confirmed, of the right order of things maintained, of the village having met its own standard for itself. Over generations, across centuries, this emotional relationship between the smell of autumn curing and the sense of communal safety and competence became one of the deepest roots of village identity. The autumn smoke was not just what you did, it was who you were, part of the olfactory autobiography of the community. The smell that came back to you in old age when someone asked you to remember your childhood village, and you found beneath the visual memories, beneath the sounds of remembered voices and bells and river water, the smell of October in the village, cold air and wood smoke and curing fish, the smell of the world preparing to survive itself, the smell of the autumn that came every year and always would. This is why the knowledge of the autumn curing was so durable, so resistant to the ordinary processes of cultural erosion that wear away so many practices over time. It was not maintained merely by being useful, though it was useful. It was maintained by being felt, by carrying, in its smell, in its seasonal rhythm, in its collective character, an emotional charge that no amount of rationalization could replace. When people smoked fish in October, they were not just preserving food. They were doing the thing that October was for. They were being, in the most fundamental and inarticulate sense, themselves. And the children breathing the smoke at the doorways of their cottages, watching the adults at their purposeful work, laying down in their developing nervous systems the olfactory memories that would anchor their identity for the rest of their lives. They were not just learning a skill, they were becoming people who knew this smell and what it meant, who belonged to a place and a season and a way of doing things, who carried inside them, in the wordless language of scent and emotion and felt memory, the whole weight of the community's accumulated knowledge of how to stay alive. This is what culture smells like. This is what tradition feels like, from the inside. Chapter 12. The fire never truly goes out. The medieval village is gone, not merely changed or transformed or updated to modern conditions. Gone, in the sense that the specific texture-rich, intensely local form of collective life it represented has not persisted into the present. The physical villages, many of them, are still there. The stone-built ones, at least. In the harder landscapes of northern England and Scotland and Central Europe, where the materials were permanent enough to outlast the civilization that first assembled them. You can walk through a village in the Yorkshire Dales, or the Cotswolds, or the uplands of Germany, and see walls and lanes and field patterns that were laid down in the medieval period and have not substantially changed since. The shape of the place persists even where the life within it has been utterly transformed. But the smokehouse at the edge of the wood is gone. Or rather, it is present in a handful of places where tradition has been consciously maintained and heritage has been deliberately preserved, where someone decided, at some point in the modern period, that the old way was worth continuing, not because it was necessary, but because it was true. Because it represented something that mattered, because the world it came from had something to teach the world that came after. In those places, the herring smokeries of Great Yarmouth that still process a small fraction of what was once an industrial output, the traditional fish smokehouses of the Scottish Highlands, where salmon is still cured over burning oak chips in buildings whose walls carry a century of black residue, the family-run smokehouses of the Baltic coast, where eel and sprat are still smoked in the old way for the local market. The fire has never entirely gone out. It would be easy to tell the story of the end of medieval fish smoking as a story of obsolescence, of a technology that served its purpose for a millennium and then was rendered unnecessary by the development of better alternatives, and that therefore declined and disappeared, as all obsolete technologies eventually do. Ice harvesting and commercial ice storage in the early 19th century. Mechanical refrigeration from the 1860s onward. The refrigerated rail car that transformed the meat and produced trades. The domestic refrigerator, spreading through middle-class homes from the 1920s and reaching genuine mass penetration by the 1950s. The container ship with its refrigerated holds that now carries fresh food across oceans. At each stage, the need for salt and smoke preservation receded a little further, until what had once been the indispensable technology of winter survival became a specialty craft. practiced for flavor rather than for necessity. This is true, and yet it is not the whole story, because it accounts for only one of the things that the autumn curing was doing. And the autumn curing was always doing several things at once. Preserving food was one. Creating trade goods was another. Fulfilling religious obligation was a third. Building and renewing community identity was a fourth. Teaching the young the skills and the values of collective effort was a fifth. And the flavors, the specific, irreplaceable flavors that the combination of salt and smoke and time produced in the flesh of the fish were yet another, and perhaps the most durable of all. Because flavors do not become obsolete in the way that technologies do. Consider what happened as refrigeration made the necessity of smoking and salting progressively less urgent. In places where the tradition was ancient and deeply embedded, the practice did not immediately stop. It shifted purpose. It moved from the category of necessity into the category of preference. From we smoke the fish because we must, to we smoke the fish because we like it, because it tastes of something that fresh fish does not, because it connects us to a way of eating and a way of being in a place that we are not yet ready to abandon. This shift happened at different rates in different communities, over a period of roughly a century from the 1870s to the 1970s, and it happened unevenly, faster in cities where the break with rural tradition was quicker and more complete, slower in coastal communities where the fishing culture remained vital and the old skills were still in living memory. In some places, the shift never fully completed. There are communities in Northern Europe, in Norway, in Iceland, in the Scottish Islands, in the Baltic states, in parts of Germany and the Netherlands, where smoked fish is not a specialty product or a nostalgic recreation, but a living part of the food culture, something that people eat regularly and prepare at home or buy from small local producers, using methods that have not fundamentally changed in centuries. In these places, the thread of continuity is unbroken, the knowledge passed from generation to generation without a gap, maintained not by the urgency of winter necessity, but by the stubbornness of taste and the pride of craft and the cultural identity that the old practice carries. In Iceland, the tradition of hanging fish to dry in the cold North Atlantic wind, a method even older than smoking, is still practiced today. Producing the hard, wind-dried stockfish that Icelanders call harfiska and eat as casually as a snack, tearing off pieces and eating them with butter as they walk. The flavors so intensely fishy and salty and ancient tasting to an unaccustomed palate that it seems to contain the whole North Atlantic in each chew. In Norway, the tradition of rikefisk, fermented trout, another ancient preservation method predating smoking, is still practiced in the inland valleys where the freshwater trout runs were once the autumn bounty, the fish buried in salt and left to ferment for months in a process of biological transformation that produces something so powerfully flavored that it is, to the uninitiated, almost challenging, and to the native, simply the taste of autumn and tradition and belonging. In Scotland, the kipper, the cold smoked herring, split and cured over oak chips, survived the refrigeration revolution, specifically as a breakfast food. Its strong, smoky, salty flavor becoming the defining taste of a traditional British morning meal in a way that has proved remarkably resistant to the tides of dietary fashion. Kippers were eaten by Victorian mill workers for the same reason they had been eaten by medieval peasants. They were cheap, nutritious, filling, and the flavor was good, and they continued to be eaten by post-war Britons, partly out of habit and partly because the flavor, once acquired, is genuinely compelling. The smokehouses of Craster in Northumberland, of Arbroath in Scotland, where the Arbroath smoky is still made by a handful of traditional producers, of Loch Fyne, where smoked salmon has been produced for centuries. These are not museums of a lost technology. They are living continuations of a practice whose original necessity has passed, but whose products remain irreplaceable in their flavor, worth every effort of their production. And then there is the broader cultural revival of smoking and curing that has been underway. Globally, for the last 20 or 30 years, the rediscovery of preserved foods by a food culture that had spent several generations treating salt and smoke and fermentation as primitive techniques superseded by the cleaner and more controllable technologies of refrigeration. And that is now recognizing, with the particular intensity of rediscovery, how much was lost in that supersession. The charcuterie movement, the artisanal fish curing revival, the home smoking kits and the cold smoker attachments, and the books on traditional preservation that line the shelves of the food-interested middle class. All of this is a cultural conversation about what we gave up when we gave up necessity, and what we might recover if we chose to. What we gave up, above all, was flavor. the particular depth and complexity of flavor that salt and thyme and smoke create in fish flesh, the layers of sweetness from the hardwood, the umami intensity of concentrated protein, the salt minerality, the slight bitterness of the phenolic compounds at the edges of the taste cannot be replicated by any other method. Fresh fish is beautiful. Refrigerated fish is convenient and nutritious and, when handled well, very good. But properly smoked fish is something else entirely, a food with a depth of character that comes from transformation rather than preservation, from the alteration of the original thing into something new that carries the traces of its origin but has become, through the agency of fire and time, itself. This flavor is ancient. It is the flavor that medieval people tasted when they took a smoked herring from the winter rafter and soaked it and cooked it in their February pot. And it is the flavor that people taste today when they eat a properly made kipper or a cold smoked salmon or a traditionally cured eel from the Dutch coast. The continuity of the flavor across the centuries is not merely a pleasing historical fact. It is the evidence that something real was preserved, not just the fish, but the knowledge of how to transform it, carried forward through the human chain of practice and taste, from the medieval smokehouse to the present. What the smoke preserved, in the end, was more than fish. It preserved a relationship with a particular kind of food, made in a particular way, tasting of particular things. It preserved the knowledge of how to make it, in the hands and the memories of the communities that practiced it generation after generation. It preserved a form of collective identity built around a shared seasonal activity and the flavors it produced. It preserved, even as the necessity that gave rise to it receded, and the villagers that first practiced it transformed beyond recognition. A set of human values, the value of collective effort, of accumulated knowledge, of seasonal attention to the rhythms of the natural world, of making something that will last. These values did not die with the medieval village. They are not dead now. They persist wherever someone lights a smoker in October and hangs fish in the fragrant dark and tends the fire through a long autumn day and takes at the end of it a properly smoked fish that will last for months and tastes of all the autumns that have ever been. They persist in every kitchen where a smoked herring is soaked and cooked and eaten with appreciation for the complexity it has achieved. They persist in every conversation about food and tradition and the way that what we eat connects us to where we come from and who we are. The fire in the old smokehouse at the edge of the wood went out a long time ago. The ash has long since scattered. The building itself is gone, returned to the earth from which its timbers were cut. The only trace of it perhaps a slight darkening of the soil in a corner of a field that was once a village and is now farmland or woodland or the edge of a housing development. The village that it served is gone. The people who tended it are gone, dissolved into the vast anonymous past of ordinary human life that does not get recorded in chronicles or remembered in histories. But the knowledge is not gone. The taste is not gone. The practice of taking the autumn fish and transforming them with salt and fire into something that will endure, that practice is not gone. It is carried forward wherever someone still does it, in the great commercial operations and the tiny artisanal smokehouses and the backyard smokers and the kitchen experiments of the curious and the taste memories of the people who grew up eating smoked fish and will never quite lose the flavor of it. And every October, when the air turns cold and the fish are running and the evenings come early and the smell of wood smoke is suddenly everywhere, in that moment, something in the deep human nervous system stirs. Something older than the medieval period, older than recorded history, as old as the first human being who noticed that meat kept near a fire lasted longer than meat kept away from one, and began, with that noticing, the long human story of learning to carry the present forward into the future through the transforming medium of fire. The fire never truly goes out. It is banked, cooled, reduced to embers, but not out. And every autumn, across all the centuries, someone adds the right wood and blows on the right coals, and the smoke rises again, fragrant and ancient and purposeful, carrying the smell of every autumn that has ever been into this one. Sleep now. The fish are curing. The winter will be survived. It always has been. This story is rooted in the documented history of medieval food preservation across northern Europe, drawing on the records of the great herring fisheries of the North Sea and Baltic, the salt trade of the Hanseatic League, the traditions of smoking in England, Scandinavia, Scotland, and the Low Countries, and the profound role of the Church's fasting calendar in shaping the medieval diet. The science of smoke preservation is accurately described as it is currently understood. The village, the people, and the specific voices are imagined from the evidence, which is, in the end, the only way we have of hearing the past speak. Settle back one last time against your pillow, and let the warmth of this final telling wash over you like the smoke from an old oak fire. You have journeyed far tonight. You walked the muddy banks of medieval rivers swollen with the autumn run. You stood beside Edith in the grey morning light, her knife flashing, her hands never still, her mind always counting, always calculating the distance between now and March. You breathed the deep, woody haze of the smokehouse. You tasted, in your imagination at least, the salt and the time that went into every strip of cured fish hanging from those blackened rafters. And now the fire is burning low, and it is time to rest. But before sleep takes you fully, let us draw the thread together, because every good bedtime story deserves a moment of quiet understanding before the candle goes out. What medieval villagers did each autumn was not merely practical. It was not simply a matter of following old instructions or doing what their parents had done before them. It was an act of profound faith, not only in God, though the church was always present in their lives, but in the future itself. Every fish cleaned and salted and hung in the smoke was a declaration. I believe there will be a tomorrow worth preparing for. Every hour spent tending a slow fire through the night was a quiet act of hope. We will make it through the dark. Spring will come. The river will give again. These were not people with certainties. They did not know the winter ahead would be mild. They did not know the barrels would hold. They did not know that illness would not take the strongest members of the household before February was done. They knew none of this, and yet they worked anyway, carefully, skillfully, with everything they had, because preparation is what hope looks like when it puts on its work clothes. There is something in that, don't you think, that reaches across all the centuries between their world and yours. The act of doing the careful, unglamorous, necessary thing today, even when tomorrow is uncertain, is perhaps the most quietly heroic thing ordinary human beings have ever done. Not the battles, not the grand speeches, not the crownings or the crusades. The fish, cleaned and smoked and stored against the cold. The children, fed through one more winter. The village, still standing in April. Edith never wrote anything down. No one recorded her name in any chronicle. The historians of her age were concerned with kings and councils, wars and plagues, the movements of armies and the declarations of popes. Edith gutted fish and tended fires and got her family through the winter, and no one thought to consider that worth preserving in ink. But here is the beautiful thing about history, the thing that makes it worth telling as a bedtime story rather than a dry account of dates and battles. The evidence of ordinary people survives in the most unexpected places. It survives in the blackened beams of old smokehouses still standing in Scandinavian villages. It survives in the shape of medieval fishhooks pulled from riverbeds by patient archaeologists. It survives in the pages of household accounts kept by monasteries, listing barrel after barrel of salted herring purchased in October, consumed steadily through to Lent. It survives in the word bloater, and in the word kipper, and in the phrase red herring, all of them carrying within them the memory of smoke and salt and autumn urgency. History does not only live in palaces, it lives in kitchens, it lives in smokehouses. It lives in the hands of people who never expected anyone to remember them, and who kept working anyway. So tonight, as you close your eyes, think of them just for a moment. The fishermen pulling their boats up in the grey dawn, the children learning the knife work, the old man managing the fire through the long dark hours, the woman, Edith, or whatever her name truly was, who woke before sunrise because there was always more to do, and who went to sleep each night a little less afraid of winter because she had done the work with her own hands. They are, in some quiet and unspoken way, why you are here. Generations of ordinary people who survived ordinary winters through extraordinary care and passed that thread of survival forward, hand to hand, century to century, all the way to this present moment where you lie warm and safe and well fed, listening to a story about smoked fish. The fire is very low now. The smoke has thinned to almost nothing. Good night, weary traveler. Good night to you, wherever in the world this story found you, whether you are in a warm bed in the city, or drifting off in a house where rain is tapping at the window, or listening in the small hours when sleep has been elusive and you needed something quiet and human to settle your mind. Good night to the curious ones who wonder why people in the past did the things they did. Your wondering is a gift. Never stop asking. Good night to the tired ones who worked hard today and needed a story to carry you gently out of your own world and into someone else's for a little while. You have earned your rest. Good night to the dreamers who will perhaps carry a little of willow foon with them into sleep. The smell of oak smoke, the sound of a cold river, the satisfaction of a smokehouse full, and a winter just barely survivable. The medieval village is quiet now. The last fire in the smokehouse breathes its final thread of smoke up into the cold autumn stars. The fish hang still and patient on their hooks, doing their slow and faithful work. And somewhere, in a small stone house beside a river that no longer runs as it once did, Edith finally sleeps. She got enough done today. So did you. Good night.